Amber Gibson didn't get the kind of start in life that most children do. By the age of 3, she and her older brother Connor had both been removed from their birth family and then placed into the foster care system. They were taken in by Craig and Carol Niven, and they cared for the siblings as their own and eventually became their permanent guardians. Amber grew up creative, expressive, and full of potential. She loved art, music, and animals. Her foster parents later described her as compassionate and resilient, with an energy that lit up the room. But it was clear from an early age that Amber carried a heavy emotional weight, and the same was true for brother Connor. The siblings' early years had left lasting effects, and while the Nivens did their best to provide structure and love, there were always ongoing challenges. As Amber entered her teenage years, her support needs increased, and sadly at the age of 13, she was moved back into the care system. Connor remained in the Niven home until he turned 18, and he then moved into supported accommodation. By late 2021, Amber was living at the Hillside Children's Home in Hamilton. Connor was staying just a few miles away at the Blue Triangle Homeless Hostel. Though they'd spent long stretches of their childhood apart, the siblings reconnected that year. They began messaging once again. Amber, now 16, seemed hopeful about rekindling a relationship with her brother. To her, it was a chance for a fresh start. And on the evening of November 26th, Amber told staff at the children's home that she was heading out to meet him. Amber seemed like she was really excited. Her phone was running low on battery, so she left Connor's number with the office. This was just in case. And then she walked out into the night. Connor and Amber weren't just difficult siblings. They were described by their long-term foster father as a dangerous mix. In fact, Craig Niven later testified in court that the two of them could not be left alone together. He said that they argued often, and that something about their dynamic just felt off, especially as they grew older. There were no physical attacks reported between them under his roof, but there was an undercurrent of tension that never settled. So when Amber reconnected with Connor in late 2021, after they'd both left the foster home, it was with a very cautious hope. Amber's time in care hadn't been easy at all. In June of that year, she had been SA'd by a man named Jamie Stars while she was asleep or unconscious in his flat. She bravely reported him, and her testimony led to a conviction. Jamie Stars was sentenced to over 10 years in prison. But that trauma, layered on top of a chaotic upbringing, still didn't stop Amber from trying to rebuild, but it definitely left her a little more vulnerable. The staff at Hill House Children's Unit didn't forbid Amber from seeing her brother, but they were definitely wary. One support worker tried to dissuade her from going out on that night, saying that it was too cold and too dark, but Amber insisted. After all, it was only her brother, so what could really go wrong? What none of them knew at this time was that Connor had recently become unstable, grown more isolated and more volatile. She didn't know that he would make a phone call later that night that would sound caring on the surface, but absolutely horrifying in hindsight. On the night of Friday, November 26th, Amber left her children's unit just after 9:15 p.m. She walked alone through the cold, wintry streets of Hamilton on her way to meet Connor in the town centre. By 10 p.m, the siblings were captured together on CCTV. This was near Cadzow Glen. In the image of Amber, she's smiling beside her brother, completely unaware of how important this image would later become. They were still walking together when they reached the footbridge near the park. But then, Amber wasn't seen again. By 11:30 p.m, Connor appeared alone on CCTV. He was now walking away from the wooded area. He was now visibly muddy and dishevelled. His jacket, t-shirt and shorts were all now stained with red. But whatever had happened, Connor didn't seem panicked. He just walked calmly back into the Blue Triangle office and slumped into a chair. Staff did notice that his hands were filthy and that he had some small cuts on his legs and what looked like scratches across his arms. But he just told them that he'd fallen into a ditch. He then asked to use the office telephone. Connor then called Hill House, the children's unit where Amber lived. He asked them if his sister had returned safely. The staff member who answered the phone said that this call gave her a bad feeling. She said that Connor seemed evasive and confused. He told her that they'd had an argument and that Amber had stormed off, but he couldn't tell her where. Later that night, Connor showered, he changed his clothes, and he then headed back outside with a plastic bag. The next day, he sent Amber a text message, and it read, "Are you okay?" That message was never opened. At Hill House Children's Unit, staff were growing more and more anxious. Amber hadn't returned by curfew. She wasn't answering her phone either. By the following morning, Saturday, November the 27th, her absence had now become alarming. A support worker contacted Connor, and he once again told them that Amber had just stormed off after an argument, but he couldn't give a time or a location. His answers were very vague, and when he was warned that the police would now be notified, he became defensive. Staff called the police, a missing persons report was filed, and search teams began canvassing Hamilton. Amber had never run away before, so this was a real cause for concern. On Sunday morning, 2 days after she was last seen, police officers arrived at Cadzow Glen following a report of a body found. This was Amber.
Amber Gibson, sometimes known as Amber Niven, wasn't doing anything different to any other 16-year-old on the night she went missing, according to police who are now investigating her murder.
A 16-year-old death is absolutely tragic, and certainly when it's from a homicide, so our focus is to understand Amber's last movements so that we can provide some answers to her loved ones.
Amber was reported missing from the town of Hamilton just before 10 p.m. on Friday. She was last seen on Cadzow Street after leaving home in the Hill House area around 9:15 that night. On Sunday morning, just after 10 a.m, emergency services were alerted to a body near Cadzow Glen. The next day, police formally identified the body as the missing teenager. Her death was being treated as unexplained before a murder investigation was launched on Tuesday. The park remained sealed off today, the investigation happening in the shadow of a residential street.
Just utterly shocked, really can't believe it. It's far too close to home, it's really frightening.
It's a worry that girls, especially young girls, can't walk about at night time without things like this happening to them.
Police say a key part of their investigation is to establish whether Amber knew her attacker, as they try to work out what happened in the hours leading up to the death of a 16-year-old girl who had her whole future in front of her. Well, Amber's family and loved ones are, as you'd expect, said to be devastated by her death, and people who live here are left with a lot of questions as police try to reassure them in the absence of any arrests. This park is less than a 10-minute walk from Hamilton Town Centre, which they say would have been very busy at the time she was last seen. Just the smallest detail could help them move this investigation forward.
Her body was caked in mud. Her clothing had been torn. There were bruises across her neck, head and limbs. There were 15 separate injuries to her face and skull alone. A short distance away, investigators found her mobile phone. It had been smashed into 3 pieces. Her jacket that once kept her warm was now lying in the stream.
Amber was such a well-loved, bright and lively young girl who attended as a day pupil at our academy in Bathgate. Our children and staff were all devastated by the news of this tragedy and are all working together to support each other at this difficult time. Our sympathies extend to all of Amber's loved ones and to everyone who knew her.
Brother Connor posted a tribute to Amber on Facebook. It read, "Amber, you will fly high for the rest of time. We will all miss you, especially me. I love you, Ginger Midget. Goodbye for now." But the very next day, he was arrested. The CCTV footage told a real story. From 9:51 p.m. to 10 p.m, cameras in central Hamilton captured Connor walking with Amber. First they were by the shops, and then they moved on to the wooded entrance to Cadzow Glen. They were seen laughing. In fact, Amber even took a photo. She sent that image to a friend with the caption, "My big bro." They then vanished from the camera's view, and the next frame tells a different story. Connor reappears at 11:38 p.m. He's now on a nearby street, alone, looking dishevelled. Amber was nowhere to be seen, but had she stormed off as Connor said, or had something else happened? Just after midnight, a new camera picked him up once again. This time it was at the entrance to the Blue Triangle hostel. Now he's wearing different clothes, and just minutes later the camera captures him leaving once again. This time he's carrying a plastic bag. He moves out of frame and towards the hostel's wheelie bins. When he returns, that bag is gone. In a truly disturbing twist, Connor was not the only man that police were looking at in conjunction with the investigation into Amber. And this really is one of the most horrifying and bizarre things I've ever seen. Another man was involved, a man named Stephen Corrigan. He was 45 years old, and he was completely unknown to both siblings. And to all available evidence, it appears that completely by accident, Stephen came across Amber's body in the 2 days between her passing and when the police were finally alerted. And instead of calling for help, he decided to touch her in a violating manner. He then concealed her under more branches and foliage. So, yes, just to reiterate, this man found a murder victim, and he chose to do that rather than call for help. He later told police that if his DNA was on her, it must have been from relieving himself in the bushes months earlier. His father, William, aged 79, also stood up for his son, claiming that he was completely innocent. He said that he was with him at his home in Blantyre between the 26th and 28th of November 2021. However, forensic biologists were clear. His DNA was found in 39 locations on Amber's body. This included locations that would have been covered by her clothing. And his DNA wasn't simply present on the scene, it was concentrated. It matched skin cells and saliva. There was no other reasonable explanation for how his genetic material could get there, except for real and disgusting contact. The judge would later tell Corrigan, any decent human being, on coming across the naked body of a young girl, would immediately call the emergency services. You, on the other hand, did not. And for those choices that he made, for what he did do and for what he didn't do, he would face some real consequences of his own. However, first, both men had to stand trial. Connor Gibson's trial began in July of 2023 at the High Court in Glasgow. He denied all charges. He claimed that he'd simply argued with Amber and walked away. He couldn't explain the red DNA on his clothing, the DNA on her body, or the evidence in the bin. You see, police would investigate that bin outside the hostel and find a white Levi t-shirt, a pair of red-stained grey shorts and a face mask. Amber's DNA was on them, and so was Connor's. Forensic biologists concluded that the only logical explanation for the red, for the transfer of skin cells, and for the damage to Amber's clothing was that Connor had attacked her. He had forcibly removed her clothing, he violated her, and then he left her alone in the woods, partially buried under branches. His defense lawyer did admit that he had assaulted her, but he also insisted that he didn't mean to end her time on this earth. The prosecution laid out 21 different points of evidence, all linking Connor directly to Amber's violation, attack, and murder. There was DNA, CCTV, texts, phone calls, and lies. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from the pathologist. Amber's time had come to an end by manual pressure to the neck, and this means that the final thing she saw was the face of her brother. On September the 4th, 2023, Connor Gibson stood silently in the dock at the High Court in Livingston. He was sentenced to life in prison. He must serve at least 22 years, at which point he can apply for parole.
You've been convicted of the physical assault and murder of your younger sister, Amber Niven, as she liked to be known. Like you, she had not had the best start in life, being fostered and then residing in a children's home. She also had to deal with having been raped. She would have looked to you as a big brother for support. She was looking forward to meeting up with you on the night she was murdered. She even posted a selfie of both of you on Snapchat. You walked with her to Cadzow Glen. There you beat her about the head breaking her nose, removed her clothing and assaulted her with intent to rape, and then manually strangled her to death. The last person she saw alive was you, her brother, strangling the life out of her, having beaten her up and tried to rape her. What you did was truly evil. In sentencing you, I take into account your age, your difficult background, everything that's been said on your behalf, background report, your lack of criminal record, and of course the circumstances of your appalling crimes. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment.
Stephen Corrigan was sentenced at the same hearing. He received 9 years for interfering with Amber's body and attempting to conceal it.
A depraved case. I mean, that word was used in court today.
It was, and in fact the judge also used the word evil to describe Conor Gibson's crimes, which, as you rightly say, he will now spend the rest of his life in prison, a minimum of 22 years before he will be considered, and the judge stressed considered, for release on parole. Now, the crime itself was, as you say, a depraved one. Conor Gibson walked his younger sister, 16-year-old Amber, to Parklands. He then proceeded to try and cover up his crimes. He lied repeatedly, in the words of the judge, before CCTV footage and indeed forensic evidence ultimately exposed his lies, and he was convicted after a 2-week trial.
The Nivens, Amber and Conor's former foster parents, were present in court. After the verdict, they released a quiet, devastating statement. We now have one daughter buried in Larkhall Cemetery and another child in prison. Life will never be the same. They also said what many had come to believe, that Amber had been failed by the care system, failed by social services, failed by so many people that were meant to protect her, and failed by the one person that she should have been able to trust the most, her big brother. I just find it so awful that Amber was failed so many times, and on top of that, a random man then disrespected her this one final time. The world really is just so awful sometimes. What are we doing? Poor girl. It started just after 6 a.m. on Monday, July the 25th, 2022. Humberside police officers spotted a Volkswagen Polo travelling on the B1230 between Seaton and Hornsey. Moments earlier, they'd been told that the driver might be connected to a serious incident in Beverley. When they tried to stop the car, it did not slow down. In fact, it accelerated, and what followed was a short but dangerous pursuit. The Polo weaved across lanes, hitting speeds of up to 84 miles per hour. Officers later said that they saw it hugging corners on the wrong side of the road, forcing oncoming drivers into evasive manoeuvres. One pursuing officer described the driver's behaviour as deliberate and not panicked. Another said it looked as though he was steering towards the van, the vehicle that he eventually struck. There were no brake lights seen. There was no attempt to avoid the collision. And when the dust settled, 46-year-old Ben Crosby was ended almost instantly in the driver's seat. The van driver was trapped in the wreckage. He had serious injuries to his spine, ribs and pelvis. It was only when police began piecing together who Crosby was and where he'd been earlier that morning that they understood the true scale of what had just happened. Ben Crosby was 46 years old, a sports massage therapist who had built a small but steady business called Alleviate Massage. He was known locally for his quiet, reserved manner, though some of his friends said he could be quite intense, driven, competitive, and set in his ways. Becky Reese Hughes was almost 10 years younger, a mother of two. She was studying physics at Hull University. Her professors described her as bright, caring and passionate. Her friends called her the life and soul of the party, someone who could bring warmth to any room that she entered. The couple had met in 2015. At first, their relationship was steady, comfortable and even. They lived in Beverley, a quiet East Yorkshire market town, and outwardly they appeared settled. Becky juggled studies, work and motherhood. Ben focused on his business and maintaining the home. Those who knew them at the time saw no obvious cracks. There were smiles in photos, There were the normal routines, a family that, from the outside, looked quite unremarkable, and in that sense, they were safe. But beneath the surface, tensions were already taking root, the kind of tension that would only reveal itself slowly in small, private moments. Becky's days were full. At the university, she thrived. She was among the top performers in her class, and she also volunteered on outreach projects in order to encourage more young women into physics. At home, she balanced raising her boys with her coursework and her part-time jobs. Friends said that she was ambitious and always chasing new experiences. That drive sometimes pulled her in directions that Ben didn't share. He was more content to stay in and to keep a tight routine. She wanted to explore, to meet new people, and to take on extra shifts at a pub where the atmosphere was lively and unpredictable. In May 2022, she took a job at the King's Head pub in Beverley Town Centre. It was a busy social environment, a strong contrast to her quiet study hours and her domestic responsibilities. Ben would sometimes visit, have a drink, and then wait for her to finish her shift. Other nights he stayed home. Those who saw them together in this period still thought of them as a couple planning for their future. They spoke about getting married, about finding the right venue. On Ben's birthday, June the 30th in 2022, he proposed in Hornsey. Becky said yes, and to outsiders it looked like a new chapter was beginning. But in private, not everything was as harmonious as it seemed. The King's Head pub was often packed out with regulars and tourists. It was also where Becky began forming new friendships, connections outside of the world that she shared with Ben. Colleagues recalled that she enjoyed the energy of the place. She was quick to laugh, often staying to chat after her shift ended. And it was there that she met one of the chefs, a man that she grew closer to as the weeks went on. To those around her, there were signs, small but telling, that things between Becky and Ben might not be as solid as they'd once seemed. One co-worker said that Becky often sought excuses to remain at work longer, describing it as where she could have more fun. A neighbour later remembered seeing them in the street one day, with Ben gripping Becky's upper arm while speaking sharply, and not in a loving way. Ben also began to notice changes too. Becky's phone was always nearby. She was seen laughing at private messages. Something in her attention had shifted and he could feel it. By mid-July, tension had now replaced the easy rhythm that they'd once had. It didn't just stay as a suspicion for long. Ben confronted Becky, and she admitted to having an affair with the chef from work. However, she assured him that it was over. They agreed to stay together, even get engaged, as if sealing a new promise to each other. But in reality, the contact with her lover actually continued. On July the 24th, Becky sent him 8 text messages, one of which read, "I can't get over you. I'm trying, but I can't." Her lover didn't believe her assurances that things with Ben were fine. Becky had previously told him that she wanted to be single, that she was tired of Ben's jealousy, but later said that she would stay together for the sake of their children. Around this time, the chef received anonymous text messages, and they were warning him to stay away. He never found out who sent them, although it's obvious. Ben's ex-partner also noticed that something was off. She later told an inquest that he seemed unusually quiet, withdrawn, and was acting totally out of character. Earlier in July, he called her to say that Becky had confessed to the affair, but also claimed that she'd ended it. But he didn't sound convinced. Underneath it all, resentment and mistrust were building. The kind that doesn't just dissipate. It simmers, building pressure until it finally finds an outlet. Looking back, several people recalled moments that felt uneasy, though at the time they didn't see where all of this was leading. A colleague at the King's Head pub remembered spotting Ben and Becky outside one afternoon. Ben was raising his voice and grabbing her by the arm. Others noticed smaller signs too. Ben now turned up more often at her workplace. Becky was growing more reluctant to head home after her shifts, continuing to linger with co-workers instead. One neighbour recalled a fleeting moment on the street where Becky greeted someone warmly, only for her expression to harden as she noticed Ben was watching her. It was subtle but enough to suggest an underlying tension. Friends described Becky as independent and outgoing, but also as someone who was drawn into trying to keep the peace, even if it meant downplaying her own unhappiness. To them, it was clear that she was trying to navigate a difficult situation whilst trying to avoid confrontation, but whatever balance she was trying to hold on to was slipping away. Sunday, July the 24th, 2022, began much like any other day. Becky worked an evening shift at the Fire Pit pub and restaurant, a different venue from the King's Head, but still in the heart of town. On that night, Ben came in. He stayed after her shift ended at 9 p.m, and the two of them were seen having drinks together before leaving for their Salmon Road home. At around 1:45 a.m, CCTV captured them leaving the house once again. Where they went and why, it isn't fully clear, but it's believed that they returned home later that night. What happened inside that house over the next few hours would not be witnessed by anyone outside of its walls, but by dawn, it was all over, and at 6 a.m, Ben picked up his phone and called the only people that he could think of, his parents. They would later tell an inquest that he sounded distressed. His voice was flat but urgent, panicked but controlled. "I've messed up really bad. I've killed her." They drove straight to Salmon Road. When they arrived, Ben was outside in the car. He was pale and shaking. He followed them into the house. Inside the front room, Becky was on the sofa. There was no movement, no response. The warm, bright presence their family knew was now gone forever. Ben's father told him that he was calling the police. Ben said, "I'm gone," and moved for the back door. His mother ran after him. He turned back. He gave them both a final hug. He said that he was sorry, and then at 5:54 a.m, his father dialed 999. He told the operator exactly what his son had said. He also voiced a fear that felt like certainty, what Ben could do to himself. Within minutes, patrol cars were circulating. A sighting came through on the B1230 between Seaton and Hornsey. It was the Volkswagen Polo with Ben at the wheel. While officers converged on the roads, detectives secured the house, and what they found confirmed the worst. Becky had suffered multiple sharp strikes. There was also signs of significant blunt force trauma. The early view was that her time on this earth had been brought to an end in a domestic targeted attack. Senior investigating officer DCI Alan Curtis later said that there were no other suspects. This was an isolated incident, adding that there was no wider risk to the public. Outside, the blue lights moved farther from Beverley and closer to the coast. The chase was already underway. The collision with the van near Hornsey ended the pursuit, but it did not end the damage. An electrician driving the Ford Transit van survived, but his injuries were described as serious and potentially life-changing. He had a wedding planned for the following month, but it would not go ahead. Back in Beverley, word spread fast. Friends and colleagues began posting tributes for Becky. A co-worker called her a lovely girl. On campus, her professor remembered a student who'd achieved some of the highest marks in her year. They described her as passionate in her studies, but also equally passionate when she spoke about her children. Police named Becky publicly. They confirmed that they were not looking for anyone else, and the force referred the pursuit to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. An investigation later closed with no action against officers. What happened on the road was all Ben's fault. At the inquest into Becky's ending, the medical findings were clear. Her time was ended by loss of vital fluids. Along with the sharp impacts, there were also blunt impacts to the head, and the coroner concluded that she had been unlawfully ended. During another inquest, it examined Ben's final half an hour. Jurors watched dashcam footage from pursuing units. The entire chase had been recorded, and it showed him taking a bend on the wrong side of the road at high speed. It also did not show any brake lights. A forensic collision investigator offered two possibilities: distraction or intent, and the jury, by majority, reached a verdict of accidental death. There is no sentence to read here, no courtroom to watch, no chance for Becky to speak for herself, but the record stands.
Yesterday morning, at around 6 a.m, a woman was found dead in one of these houses after police received reports of a concern for her safety. A man was reported to have fled the scene in a car and a police chase ensued. Unfortunately, the man driving the car crashed at a site in Hornsey, which resulted in his death, but also an innocent van driver to incur life-changing injuries. The official police statement reads the following. A murder investigation is underway following the discovery of a woman's body at a property in Beverley yesterday in the early hours of Monday the 25th of July that is believed to be connected to an investigation into a road traffic collision near Hornsey later that same morning. Senior Investigating Officer, Detective Chief Inspector Alan Curtis said, "Whilst we are in the early stages of our inquiries, I can reassure the public that this is an isolated incident and there is no ongoing or wider risk to the public." Officers discovered the woman's body at a house on Salmon Road in Beverley after receiving reports of a concern for her safety. As part of our inquiries, a man was reported to have left the address in Beverley in a Volkswagen Polo at around 6 a.m. The car was later seen by police officers on the A1035 between Seaton and Hornsey, and a short police pursuit ensued. The Polo was then in a collision with another vehicle, a Ford Transit van, at around 6:30 a.m. The driver of the Polo was pronounced dead at the scene. The man driving the Ford Transit van was taken to hospital with serious and potentially life-changing injuries and remains in hospital at this time. As there was a police pursuit, the incident has been referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct to be independently reviewed. The woman's family have been informed of her death and the investigation into her murder and are being provided support by specially trained officers. The man's family have also been informed of his death and specially trained officers are in contact with them and offering support. Specialist roads policing officers are in contact with the driver of the Ford Transit and their family to offer support and updates in regards to the investigation. Police have asked that if anyone wants to get in touch to aid the investigation, even anonymously, if they just call 101 and quote log 66 of the 25th of July 2022, they can give some information that way. This is the house over here where a police cordon is still in place.
A mother and student, described by those who knew her as bright, fun, caring and kind, in a relationship that looked settled from the outside, but was falling apart at the seams. In early 2020, Louise Aitchison was trying to rebuild her life. She'd been stalked and harassed by her former partner, and the trauma of that ordeal had led to one good thing, a relocation. Her new flat on Park Terrace in East Kilbride was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where she could feel safe once again. To make this even better, she now lived just 2 closes down from her mother. She still walked her dog every day. She was reconnecting with her friends. She was smiling more, beginning to enjoy life once again, and then she met someone new. This new guy's name was Daryl Patterson. They crossed paths whilst walking their dogs. It all seemed pretty innocent, pretty harmless. They both loved animals, and Louise, with her enormous heart, saw something in him. She liked him so much that he moved in by March. But what Louise didn't know, and what nobody told her, was that Patterson already had convictions for DV in 2016 and 2017. And worse even still, he was facing new allegations from a previous partner at the time that he entered Louise's life. Less than a month after moving in, the signs were already there. Police were called to the flat on March the 24th. An officer, alarmed by Patterson's presence and known history, then submitted a formal request under Scotland's Domestic Abuse Disclosure Scheme. It's called a Power to Tell application. It allows police to proactively warn a person if their partner poses a known risk. So really, this sounds like an amazing idea. The officer flagged it, and a decision was made to tell Louise. The warning meant for Louise sat dormant in a system designed to protect her. It had been formally approved on April the 9th. That's when police officers agreed, yes, she needed to know. She had a right to be told that the man in her flat had a documented history of violence against women. Under police guidelines, that kind of disclosure must be made within 10 days. But when officers logged that report, they left out some crucial details. There was no incident number. There was no current mobile number. There was no confirmation of address. So all of this meant when another officer tried to follow up 14 days later, on April the 23rd, they couldn't even reach her. They attempted a phone call, but with no correct number on file, the effort failed before it began. And then there was no further attempt. The system did not flag the missed deadline. There was no red alert. Nobody noticed the oversight. And because the form lacked an incident number, other officers couldn't even find it unless they knew exactly where to look. But they didn't. So Louise was never warned. Even on the night that Louise called 999 herself and asked officers to remove Patterson from her flat, the responding officer didn't mention any of this to her. They just let Patterson leave. They logged the call as always, and then they left her there. According to Police Scotland's own watchdog, the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, or PIRC, this failure was critical. Had she been told about Patterson's background, the report stated, she may have taken action to avoid him and ensure her safety. But by the time this disclosure was due, Daryl Patterson had already told officers he intended to return to the flat to pick up his stuff, admitting that he had no intention of staying away. Later, Police Scotland would defend their decision not to disclose this at the time of the 999 call, saying that it may not have been appropriate. But Louise's mother, Caroline Leon, later said they might as well have put a target on her back, because when no one tells you the truth about the person that you live with, it shows a level of negligence veering on betrayal. And now the scene is set. We move on to Tuesday night, where the sun had just set over East Kilbride. Inside the flat on Park Terrace, things were escalating. Louise picked up the phone at 10:45 p.m. and then dialed 999. At just 4'11" and barely 9 stone, Louise had no idea that she'd been left in a flat completely unprotected, with a man who had previously stalked, beaten and threatened other women that he'd been in a relationship with. But a small mercy is that he was ushered out of the home by police. However, as we know, this was done with the agreement that he could later pick up his stuff. And as you can imagine, a real slow-motion nightmare is unfolding before us. By the time police finally confirmed what had happened to Louise, Daryl Patterson had already tried to confess twice. His first stop was a friend's house. At 1 a.m. on April the 29th, he showed up at Adam Ford's door. He was dishevelled and shaking. Although he was in a state, he was still sober enough to say something chilling. I've done something really bad. I'm going to go away for a very long time. My life's over. He then stayed the night with Adam. By the time morning arrived, he was now crying. But he still didn't just turn himself in. Instead, he drifted through East Kilbride, drinking heavily, taking substances and spiralling into panic. He went to his sister Kaya's home next, and this time he said it plainly. She's gone. I've done something really bad. When she asked what he meant, Patterson told her that Louise was in the bedroom of the flat, that she'd had a sharp implement, that there had been an argument, and that she punched me on the throat, he said. I told her not to do that, but she hit me again. She was kicking me and things got ugly. Suddenly I was on top of her with my hands around her throat. Then, chillingly, he dragged his hands across his neck and added, and then it happened. He told her that the weapon was in the kitchen and that he'd washed it. Patterson then made multiple calls to the police after that. One time he told them that he had committed a serious offence. Another time he said that he was carrying a weapon. But the system that hadn't flagged him as a serious risk still wasn't catching up to what had already happened. Even when police met with him in person, he wasn't taken into custody. He was sent to a hospital instead, and then released. By the time Louise's family began to worry, she had already been gone for days. Her mother Caroline lived nearby, and she was used to regular text messages and check-ins. But now, Louise wasn't answering. It was just not like her to disappear. On April the 30th, police were finally called once again to check on her welfare. This would be their 6th visit to the flat, since Louise had called 999, and this time, they finally forced entry. Entering the flat set alarm bells ringing, and as they moved further in, the full horror was revealed. Inside the bedroom, they found Louise's body. She had been carefully covered with a blanket. 3 sharp implements were later discovered in the kitchen sink, one of them believed to be the murder weapon, although it had been washed. The grief was immediate, but this wasn't just about the loss. It was the preceding silence, the delay, the unthinkable knowledge that Louise had been left alone in that flat, no longer breathing for 2 days, while police officers knocked gently on her door and then walked away. Later, her mother would be told that calling cards had been removed for evidence, but when Caroline visited the flat, there were never any calling cards to be found. When Louise's body was still lying there, the woman who had asked for help, the woman who had waited, the woman who'd been failed over and over again, and for 2 days nobody knew. Or maybe it seems some people never actually wanted to know at all. It wasn't until April the 30th, after Louise's body was finally found, that police located and then formally arrested him. By then, he had already tried to confess. It's not like he was hiding. Instead, he was publicly spiraling, but still he slipped through every single crack. When Caroline was finally told that her daughter was gone, the news was delivered in fragments. Officers didn't confirm it at first. They asked her what tattoos Louise had. They said that a family liaison officer was on the way. Meanwhile, outside the flat, flashing lights and police tape told the entire community what had happened. Friends were already trying to remove tributes from social media, hoping to shield the family from the worst of it. But Caroline already knew. The only thing she didn't know yet was just how bad this truly was. She wouldn't learn the details of her daughter's final moments until court. The family was advised not to view Louise's body, as her injuries were too extreme. There would be no final goodbye, no hand to hold, no face to touch or kiss. This shattered the mother, and then came the second shock. The paperwork, the timelines, and the failures. Mother Caroline learned that police had made 18 separate errors in the week leading up to Louise's demise. She learned that they had formally agreed to warn her daughter about Patterson's violent past, but also that they had failed to deliver that warning due to the missing details in the database. She learned that Patterson was already facing new allegations when he moved into Louise's home, that she had been moved to that flat for her own safety after being stalked by another man. And then, the one fact that wouldn't stop circling her mind, they had 5 weeks to warn her, Caroline said, and they didn't. This mother began demanding answers. Caroline spoke to MPs, to journalists, to watchdog groups. She sat down with senior officers from Police Scotland, where they admitted to her face to face that they had failed. She was told that now some changes had been made. There were new flagging systems, better procedures in place, but that there would be no disciplinary action, no names and no accountability. So Caroline kept on digging. She began pushing for a fatal accident inquiry, which is a formal investigation into the chain of decisions that had failed her daughter. She didn't want sympathy. Now she wanted change. And that's because, as she put it, maybe others can live with that on their conscience, but I can't. What we know about the night in question is this. Less than 1 hour after being told to leave, Patterson then returned, and once inside, he launched a violent attack. He applied pressure to the neck until Louise was nearly gone, and then came the sharp force strike to the neck. By midnight, Louise's time on this earth had already come to an end. She was covered with a blanket, and then Patterson just walked out the door again. Nobody was watching him. Strangely, during those 2 days, Even though officers came to her door again, even though they knocked 6 times in total, it took them that long to force entry, even when she didn't respond, not even when it seems like all the signs were there. In January of 2023, nearly 3 years after her death, Daryl Patterson was sentenced to life in prison. He will serve a minimum of 18 years before being considered for parole. In court, Judge Lady Stacy told him, "She was entitled to look to you for love and support, but you betrayed her trust. You took her life." But for Mother Caroline, that sentence means very little. She still wakes up with questions. She still wonders what could have been done differently. She still fights to make Louise's death mean something. With the inquiry, there may be reforms, but what remains is this. A 33-year-old woman called for help, but she was not warned, she was not protected. That help never came. She spent her final moments alone with a monster in a flat that she was told would keep her safe. Emily Jean Schwartz had a way of standing out. She was the girl that ran around in polka dot pants and a striped shirt dancing. Her stepmother Prudy recalled. She was always very happy. She absolutely loved to sing. She was a good singer. Her friends remembered her for her love of sparkly things. Her cat Oreo, her dog Remy, and summer days at Hampton Beach with her best friend Lauren. Her mother Adrienne described her as a beautiful, aspiring singer whose hope and determination to survive shone brightly. Emily earned her LNA license and found joy in caring for others, but she had dreams of becoming a cosmetologist, a way of helping people feel good about themselves, even when she sometimes struggled to feel that way about herself. She loved adventures, camping, trips, hiking, rock climbing, and trips to Acadia with her family. But in private, there were shadows. Her mother said she'd seen bruises and scratches on her daughter. There were stories about arguments. Arguments had escalated into physical confrontations. Emily sometimes downplayed them. Sometimes she asked for help. But she always went back to Joseph. The weekend before the trip to Vermont, Adrienne said she felt something that she couldn't shake off. I froze. There was a very strong, overwhelming feeling that my life was in danger from him. I wasn't correct that it was my life. It was my daughter's. In the Burlington courtroom, prosecutor Sarah George held Joseph's written statement in her hand. "You told police you went to get breakfast the morning after Emily died," she asked. "Yes," Joseph replied. "You didn't tell them you went to the police immediately because you were scared for your life." "No." She reminded the jury of what he'd also admitted, that after breakfast he'd moved the van with Emily's body still inside it. "Does that sound like self-defense to you?" she asked pointedly. Joseph's eyes stayed low. He said, "I wasn't thinking clearly." But Prosecutor George's tone never softened. She pressed on inconsistencies. The claim that Emily might have had a firearm, even though it was later found under his control. The garbage bag that was found over her head. Every answer seemed to sink him further. From the jury box, one juror scribbled down notes. Another leaned back and crossed their arms. The story Joseph was telling now was not the one it had told police in October of 2021, and George was trying her best to make sure that the jury noticed. The man who broke this case open was not a detective. It was just after midnight on October the 19th, 2021, when Vermont 911 dispatchers took a call from a man named Spencer Lemons. His voice was tense. He said his friend Joseph Alazzo had just confessed to killing his wife. And right then, barely any time had passed. He said it happened that weekend. Spencer told them Joseph said that her remains were still inside the camper van, and that van was now parked at a residence on Meadowbrook Lane in St. Albans town. Joseph had just been riding in Spencer's Jeep when the conversation turned downright chilling. Spencer said that he then kicked Joseph out of the car and called 911 immediately, and very quickly state police located the camper van. The search warrant would come later, but for now, they had in their possession a very possible murder scene, a missing 22-year-old woman, and a suspect who had just put himself at the centre of it all. But what they didn't have yet was the truth. On Monday, October the 18th, Joseph showed up at Adrienne and David Bass's home, situated in New Hampshire. He was without Emily. He told them that the couple had argued in a parking lot in Bolton. Emily, he said, got out and just walked away, and that she planned to take an Uber home. He claimed that he couldn't find her when he returned. Mother Adrienne did not believe it. Who waits 2.5 days to even tell anybody their significant other is missing? Stepmother Prudy later asked. When Joseph handed over Emily's license, Adrienne thought it was odd. At the time, she assumed that his strange shivering was from riding a motorcycle in October, but later she came to believe that it was anxiety from lying to their faces. She remembered the moment that he left the house. She thought he seemed threatening and cold, that this was an unspoken warning not to question him. But by that evening, Adrienne and David had reported Emily missing. They told police about the history of DV, about the bruises that they'd seen, about how Emily sometimes reached out for help, but then frustratingly returned to Joseph anyway. At that point, Emily had been gone for 3 days. The family still hoped that she'd simply left, that she'd had enough of the whole situation, and that they might receive a phone call from somewhere safe. But in reality, Emily's family had seen the signs long before this anniversary trip. Her mother recalled seeing scratches and bruises. Friends noticed her energy shifting and her confidence dim. But Emily was loyal, sometimes to her own detriment, and she just could not break it off. There had been notable physical altercations. This included one on New Year's Eve just months before the trip. Emily had even begun divorce paperwork at one point, but the process was stalled. Mother Adrienne said that Emily would come to them for help, only to then share everything with Joseph afterwards, so that made having conversations dangerous. We had to speak in coded language, stepfather David remembered. The mother's gut told her that something was really very wrong. I felt, as a mom, my daughter was not safe, she said, but nothing that they tried could convince Emily to walk away for good. And then, on October the 15th, 2021, she got into that van with Joseph for what was supposed to be a romantic getaway. By the morning of October the 19th, police received that call from Spencer Lemon that turned the entire investigation. When authorities turned up to the driveway in St Albans town, nearly 60 miles away from Bolton, parked there was a Chevrolet Express bus with curtains drawn tight. Detectives secured a search warrant and opened up the van. Inside the small bathroom, they found 8 plastic garbage bags. One of them was partially opened. Inside it was a leg, still wearing pants. In another compartment, police found a firearm. Behind the driver's seat lay a handsaw. Shreds of evidence still clung to it. The next step was finding Joseph. By sheer coincidence, a state trooper spotted him inside a Maple Fields convenience store. He agreed to go with investigators to the barracks. Once there, Joseph began to talk. Every word that he spoke confirmed what police had already begun to piece together. Back to the beginning of this final weekend, October the 15th, 2021, Emily and Joseph packed their converted Chevrolet Express bus for a fun weekend in Vermont. It was meant to be a celebration, their first wedding anniversary. They would meet Joseph's sister and her boyfriend. They were staying in an Airbnb at Bolton Valley Resort. Emily sent videos to her family of the scenic drive through the Green Mountains. And that evening, they chatted with Joseph's sister outside the van. At 9:39 p.m, Joseph sent a text message to her. "Hey, we're going to take the night to rest. You still drink coffee? We'll see you tomorrow morning." But inside the van that night, the conversation between husband and wife turned into an argument once again. Joseph would later claim that Emily hit and kicked him, and then she went to lay down on the bed. He says he sat in silence for several minutes. and according to his own account, he then grabbed a firearm from the cabinet, jumped on top of her, placed a pillow over her face, and then inflicted 2 blasts. Emily now lay motionless. Joseph put the garbage bag over her head and moved her body to the van's bathroom. The rest of that night passed in silence. He told them that he'd gone to breakfast with his sister the next morning. Then he'd driven a van to St Albans, where about 12 to 15 hours after the event, he dismantled Emily's body with the handsaw and then placed her into bags. No one outside of that camper van knew that Emily, who had been laughing with family just hours earlier, was now wiped from existence.
Lauren, a difficult evening here tonight as friends and family are learning this is no longer a missing persons case, but rather a homicide investigation. Vermont State Police say Joseph Ferlazzo admitted to them that he killed Emily inside of that vehicle in Bolton. In fact, they say he's provided a wealth of information into what may have happened here. This is video from outside the police barracks. There was a lot of movement here around 7:30. VSP's major crime unit vehicle was stationed. There was also what appears to be a converted camper bus nearby. Now, important to mention, I just spoke with Emily's stepmother, Prudy Schwartz, moments ago. Something she did not hesitate to tell me is that she knew something was off when it came to Emily's husband, Joseph Ferlazzo, even though she only met him just one time. She says even Emily's behavior was not like the Emily she knew once she got with him.
Something didn't click the first time. We met him and he wasn't sure what it was about him, but he did not like him. And I said, it's something with his eyes.
Now, when I asked Emily's stepmother, her relationship with Emily, she tells me it was weird to even hear the word stepdaughter or stepmother because she's been a mother to Emily for the past 20 years.
John and Alyssa, Emily's loved ones tell me it's been a difficult 2 years, but they know more challenging days lie ahead as prosecutors prep for what's expected to be an emotional trial for Joseph Ferlazzo. While they wait, though, memories of Emily stay in focus.
A contagious personality with a beautiful singing voice.
New songs will come up now. We're like, oh, we could totally imagine Emily, singing that not only in the car, but just in a room full of people or friends and around a campfire.
Kathy Eckelberger is a longtime family friend whose daughters were Emily's best friends. She says Emily was a licensed nursing assistant, passionate about cosmetology, loved sparkles, and Hampton Beach in New Hampshire.
She had this infectious laugh.
But that laughter was silenced a little more than 2 years ago. Movement on the case has been slow. Anxiety has been high, and unsettling reminders stick with the family.
And the family is holding on to his belongings. We can't do anything with him until he's prosecuted. We want to be able to get on and remember Emily without having to think about him and waiting for a trial, knowing that that's going to come up and it's going to rip open more Band-Aids.
Eckelberger says Emily's loved ones were aware she was in an abusive relationship and had spoken with her about it, but know how challenging it is for survivors to leave a relationship with their abuser.
5 days into the trial, the jury heard about the gunshot residue, about the recovered Glock, and about the 8 garbage bags pulled from the bathroom of the camper van. Now they were watching Joseph. He leaned forward as his defense attorney asked him to explain, in his own words, what happened that night in October of 2021. He spoke slowly, framing it all as a moment of survival. She was hitting and kicking me, he said. I thought she had the gun, but he couldn't say for sure. Instead, he painted the image of lying in bed while Emily lay nearby, with the fight supposedly being over. Then a blur, a single frame of memory, where his hand held a sharp implement and the cold metal met her skin. The prosecution just let the silence hang before cross-examination.
In October of 2021, Mr. Ferlazzo and his wife Emily made a plan to come to Vermont for a weekend for their 1-year anniversary. You heard from Emily's mother that Emily was excited. She was looking forward to meeting her sister-in-law, Nicole. She was in a good mood and she was looking forward to the trip. They drove up here in their van with their dog from New Hampshire on the evening of Friday, October 15th of 2021. They arrived in Vermont at the Bear Run condos at 7:20 p.m. They parked at a condo complex on Bear Run in Bolton. They met with Nicole for about 15 minutes out in the parking lot inside the van with a plan for Mr. Ferlazzo and Emily to meet them inside the Airbnb to catch up, watch Netflix, and hang out. But they never did. And we know that Emily sent her last Facebook message to her family at 8:13 p.m. We know that Mr. Ferlazzo sent a text message to his sister Nicole inside the Airbnb at 9:39 p.m. Hey, we're gonna take the night to rest, smiley face. You still drink coffee? We'll see you tomorrow morning. Shortly after, Emily's last location data from her Facebook is logged as 10:14 p.m. Instead of going inside and spending time with his sister, Mr. Ferlazzo and Emily argued. They argued because Mr. Ferlazzo had brought Emily on their 1-year anniversary to the very same condo complex that his ex-wife lived. They argued because Mr. Ferlazzo seemed to believe that he didn't have any obligations to be monogamous with his wife, be faithful to her, and she told him she was done. She told him she did not want to be with him, that she could not do it anymore, and that she wanted to leave. And 1 minute after midnight, Mr. Ferlazzo turns off his phone. Done arguing, Emily laid down in bed while Mr. Ferlazzo stayed up and stewed. He became enraged at Emily while she lay in bed scrolling on her phone with her head on her pillow. Mr. Ferlazzo sat on the couch thinking, planning. But instead of walking away from Emily, going into his sister's Airbnb, out of the van, instead he executes his plan. He got up from the couch, he went to the closet, he grabbed this Glock 19 with this silencer. He walked over to the bed. Emily's head was resting on this pillow. He picked up this throw pillow from the couch. He jumped onto the bed. He put this throw pillow over her face, and he shot her once and twice, directly into the left side of her head. And he again sleeps in the van with Emily's body still in the shower. And the next day, he goes out to Burlington with his sister. He gets coffee, and again, he goes out to eat. And again, he says nothing to Nicole about what he did to Emily. And after gallivanting around downtown, he heads back to St. Albans, and on his way, he stops at Hannaford to buy bleach. Because despite him continuing with his life as if nothing has happened, he does have a mess to clean up. He decides that he needs to make her body easier to carry, easier to move, and easier to discard. Mr. Ferlazzo uses this serrated saw and dismantles her arms, her legs, her feet, and her head from her torso. The same torso, absolutely riddled with wounds, including one striking her heart. 3 different knives had her DNA on them. At least 3 different knives were used to her heart 1 time, her abdomen 8 times, and her back 9 times. Then he puts each piece of her body.
Prosecutor George stood and pressed him on every detail. Which came first? When he aimed at her head, followed by the blasts, or the sharp implement? Why did he tell police about the garbage bag? Why still go and meet his sister for breakfast the next morning, if this had just been a moment of desperate self-defense? Joseph answered, but not convincingly. From the gallery, Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass, watched the jury's faces. She would later say, "I didn't believe they were buying it. I could see them lining up what he was saying with the forensic evidence, and it wasn't matching." However, whether this was enough for an actual conviction is another matter. On December the 13th, 2024, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Joseph Palazzo guilty of first-degree murder.
It's been 3 years since Joseph Ferlazzo killed his wife, Emily Jean, while the couple celebrated their 1-year wedding anniversary in Bolton. This morning, the jury listening to a portion of Ferlazzo's testimony for a second time. We heard around 50 minutes where he recounts the events leading up to, during, and after he killed Emily Jean. He says he feared Emily Jean was going to kill him and argues he acted in self-defense.
All I remember is feeling like three things. It was I felt like it was boom boom boom, and it was 2 shots, and then her body dropping.
And after hearing the testimony, it took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a guilty verdict. Emily's mother saying this verdict is the next best thing to having her daughter with her, and says she feels relief that justice will be served for the man who killed her.
The only thing that could make it better really is to have my daughter back in my arms and alive and breathing and singing and loving life the way that she was.
At this point, Ferlazzo will remain held without bail until his sentencing, and now that he's been found guilty, the state says he faces a minimum of 35 years in prison.
4 months later, Judge Timothy Dooley sentenced him to 42.5 years to life in prison. Emily's mother stood outside the courthouse, with the wait of 3 years finally settling. The verdict couldn't be any better, she said. For me, it was really just relief, and feeling like we got the justice that Emily deserves. Bulgur Forest is thick, humid, and almost impossible to navigate at night. There are no marked tracks. There's little to no phone signal, and there's only one way in or out by car. It's the kind of place that you'd only find if you were really trying to get away from everything and everyone, or of course if you didn't want to be found. When police arrived on the morning of September the 18th, 2021, the first thing they saw was Deanir no longer breathing. She was lying just outside the front door of the cabin, face up, shoes off. The man who'd called the police, Rowan Hansen, wasn't waiting nearby. He'd already left the area, but not before speaking to first responders and telling them the same story that he'd given on the phone. He said that Dee had suffered injuries in a car accident the night before. He said that she was alive when he left to go and find help, but when he came back, she was now gone. But what police found next cast that version of events into doubt almost immediately.
I stayed with her, fell asleep. When I came back here, she seemed okay. She seemed okay, but I didn't want to leave her.
Inside the cabin, there were streaks of red on the walls and the floorboards. There was also a mattress that was missing from the scene, and in the bush nearby, it was found dumped and soaked through. There were dark red stains visible on the fabric. Investigators would later learn that Hansen had actually tried to clean the cabin before calling anyone for help. They also found a discarded beer bottle shattered in a corner. There was no sign that any medical aid had been attempted on Dee. There were no bandages, ice, or efforts of any help at all. And 3.5 kilometers away, Hansen's ute or pickup truck was found half submerged in a ditch. So the crash that he mentioned had indeed happened, but only one person had been in the vehicle at the time that it went off the road, and it was not Dee. This road accident was not the end of her life. So what's actually happened?
38-year-old Rowan James Hansen's case was mentioned briefly in Foster Local Court this morning after he was charged with murdering Dee Anir. The 34-year-old's body was found in a cabin on Pole Dump Forest Road in the Bulgur Forest on Saturday morning. Police setting up a crime scene soon after. At around 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, investigators arrested Hansen at a home in Killawarra Street, Wingham. He was taken to Taree Police Station and charged with murder. The 38-year-old was refused bail today. The matter now heads to Taree Local Court on November 23.
In his second police interview, recorded just days after his arrest, Rowan Hansen sat slumped across the table. He spoke softly, almost rehearsed. "She hit me first," he told detectives. "I called her a name, and she came at me with a beer bottle. I ducked, then I tackled her. I didn't mean it. I just tackled her into the wall." It wasn't the first story that he told. In fact, it wasn't even the second. In total, Hansen would give police 4 different versions of what had happened on the night that Dee Anir met her end. In each one of these, the violence escalated or shifted entirely. They really couldn't pin anything down. But according to the people who knew them best, violence in this relationship was not new. Dee's mother, Carolyn Butt, told the jury that she had once seen Hansen punch her daughter in the head during a visit. Another time, she said he headbutted Dee on a camping trip. And then there was Janelle Reynolds, a close friend, who also described a brutal scene in their home. She recalled Dee being thrown into a coffee table and the glass top shattering. She said that Hansen then stomped on her. Reynolds remembered trying to lift shards from Dee's scalp and mopping up the red from the carpet. She also told the court something chilling. She said, "I remember thinking, one day he's going to kill her." Hansen's defense did not deny the violence. In fact, they leaned into it. They argued that both Hansen and Dee had violent tendencies, that they both argued constantly, and that alcohol made everything worse. They said on the night in question, it was just another fight, but this one went too far. Hansen's lawyer told the court he never meant to kill her. He accepted responsibility. That's why he tried to plead guilty to manslaughter. However, the prosecution pushed back hard. They pointed to Dee's injuries, her skull fractures, her jaw, nose and rib fractures. She had lung lacerations and signs of pressure to the neck. There were also over 100 bruises and scratches across her body. This wasn't one push. This wasn't a tackle. The words of Crown Prosecutor Carl Young as he spoke to the jury. This was sustained, deliberate violence. It was murder. In the end, the jury had to choose between 2 narratives, a volatile couple whose latest fight had just ended in tragedy, or a man with a long documented history of atrocious behaviour, someone who finally went too far, and then lied about it again and again. The truth, they discover, was hidden in the hours before that emergency call was made. Friday, September the 17th. Dee and Rowan were seen on CCTV at a supermarket in Comboyne, a quiet town about an hour from the hut. They bought supplies for their weekend away. Nothing about their behaviour stood out, but there was one detail. Dee already had a black eye. Police would later confirm that this black eye wasn't from the incident that ended her life at the cabin. The couple had planned this trip to the wilderness as a fresh start. They've been together since 2017, on and off, and though the relationship was marred by frequent fights, many of them that looked horrific to outsiders, they still always circled back to each other. This time they were driving to the pole dump hut, situated in Bulga Forest. This is a rough logger's cabin in the middle of the bush, almost entirely deserted. They called it the Witch's Hut. The couple planned to stay for 4 nights. At some point that evening, something happened on the road. Hansen drove their silver Holden rodeo ute off the road and into a ditch along the pole dump road. He was alone in the vehicle at that time, but exactly what happened next depends entirely on which version of Hansen's story that you believe. In some, he went back to the cabin and found Dee already hurt. In others, she attacked him over the car crash. He said that she swung a beer bottle at him. He says that he ducked, and then that he tackled her in self-defense. He claimed that in doing this, she hit her head on the wall and went down hard. However, there was one major issue with this story. The autopsy would show that her injuries weren't consistent with one single blow, and she didn't pass away instantly. There were signs of multiple impacts and time passing, and as that time passed, choices were made. Outside the hut as temperatures dropped, in the early hours of Saturday morning, Dee's body was left out on the ground. She was given no blanket, no cover, no attempts at CPR. There was not even a call for help until almost 11 hours later, and that delay would become one of the most damning parts of this case. Because if this really had been a tragic accident, why didn't Hansen try to save his partner? By the time that Rowan Hansen first stood trial in April of 2024, nearly 3 years had passed since Dee's death. The courtroom in Coffs Harbour was packed. Dee's mother sat through every hour of testimony. Her friends made the trip from Wingham and beyond. For many of them, this was their first time hearing the full scope of Dee's injuries, and of Hansen's lies laid out in public. The prosecution called witness after witness. They showed crime scene photos from inside the hut. They played audio from the 000 calls, which is like 911 in Australia. They replayed Hansen's conflicting police interviews, and they read aloud messages and past allegations, many never formally reported, of physical attacks that had happened. But despite all of this evidence, something didn't land with the jury. The defence leaned heavily on reasonable doubt. They said that Hansen had admitted to causing Dee's death, that he was overwhelmed and that he simply panicked. That yes, his lies were indeed cowardly, but they were not proof of murder. The jury deliberated for more than 22 hours across multiple days, and then nothing. They could not reach a verdict. The judge could only apologise to Dee's family, acknowledging the emotional toll, saying, "The court simply does not have words that can convey our sympathy." He said, "I'm sorry today has resulted in you being left without that closure." The trial was declared as a mistrial, and Rowan Hansen, despite everything, remained legally unconvicted. If Hansen's version of events was true, that Dee had hit him with a bottle, and that he tackled her in self-defense, then her injuries should have matched that single spontaneous act. But as we know, they didn't. In fact, not even close. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Alan Kaller, had seen many cases of DV, but he said that this one stood out. In fact, in court, he described Dee's injuries as catastrophic. So Hansen's story really did not make sense. Remember, there was that long list, 100 scratches and bruises, evidence of a pressure injury to the neck, and much, much more. There was no way, Dr. Kaller said, that this kind of trauma came from a single tackle, especially not if she'd fallen once, hit her head, and been knocked unconscious, as Hansen had of course claimed, and she definitely hadn't passed instantly either. The doctor explained that Dee's injuries suggested a sustained attack over a long period of time, the kind of attack that couldn't be accidental, the kind that involved force, repetition and intent. He also noted something else, the spatter inside the hut. This did not match a single impact location, which indicated movement, struggle, panic, and just violence. And then of course there was the mattress. It was found dumped in a bush, soaked in red. Hansen did later admit that he tried to hide it because he freaked out. His words to the police played in court. "I threw it out because it looked like I murdered her, and I just started myself." That statement, raw unfiltered, became a centerpiece of the Crown's case. They argued that someone acting in self-defense does not scrub stains, dump evidence, and leave a woman alone in the cold for hours. If what he was saying was true, then that person would call for help. They would try to explain. They would not lie in 4 different ways before then telling their truth.
Constant fights, yelling and arguing. That's how 2 neighbours of Dee Anir and Rowan Hansen described the pair's relationship in statements read to the court on day 3 of Hansen's murder trial. One saying, "I remember hearing the 2 of them arguing in the house at least 2 or 3 times a week. When the night came, they would start up." Today's statements coming off Hansen's mother took the stand late yesterday, detailing an argument she says she once witnessed between the 42-year-old and Ms. Anir. Dee hit him in the head with a beer bottle and a scuffle happened. Push and shove, and she fell back and hit her head. Rowan Hansen is accused of murdering Miss Anir in a remote hut in the Bulga State Forest, west of Port Macquarie, during a camping trip in September 2021. He maintains he acted in self-defence, claiming the 34-year-old attacked him with a beer bottle after they had been drinking. Hansen has pleaded not guilty to murder. The trial is expected to take 2 weeks. Alison Paul, NBN News.
The second trial was held in Newcastle in mid-2025, and it wasn't a long one. This time, the jury had the benefit of hindsight. They heard about the first trial's deadlock, about the years of delay, and the pain that was carried by Dee's family. But more importantly, they heard everything again, but now with even less room for doubt. The prosecution leaned in harder. They played the 000 recordings once again. In one of them, Hansen says, "There's no reviving her. She's passed away while I went out to get help." In another, he insists that it was a car crash, that he hadn't even been in the room when it happened. But the evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy, of course, did not match any of his stories, and the spatter in the cabin told its own truth. And the dumped mattress, Hansen had no reasonable explanation for that, except the same old story of panic. The jury began deliberating at 10:40 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 2 p.m. the next day, they had made up their minds. They were unanimous, and he was guilty. Hansen showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Justice Ian Harrison thanked the jury for their close attention, for their careful consideration of a case marred by deception and cruelty. In the gallery, Dee's family cried quietly. Finally, some relief. It had taken 4 years, 2 trials, and an unclimbable mountain of grief. But now, finally, a conviction. Rowan James Hansen is now awaiting sentence. He will return to the Supreme Court on September the 5th, 2025. The court has already heard the worst of what happened at the witch's hut, but this one final step of justice will decide how many years he'll spend behind bars for what he did, whether he will ever get the chance to walk free again, and whether Dee's loved ones get the closest thing to closure that a system can offer. Rowan Hansen spoke his lies loudly, but the evidence and the truth would not be silenced forever. The chair was still upright, a plain wooden frame, no cushions, no padding, but the marks it left behind told a silent story. David Vlow had been tied to it, using a length of old telephone cable. It had been looped tightly behind his back. The ligatures had left deep bruises around his wrists and ankles, evidence that he'd struggled, but not enough to loosen them. Nearby, police recovered a pair of scissors, a broken kitchen utensil handle, and more of the same telephone cord that had once held him captive. There were no signs of blunt force impacts. There were no external injuries that could explain what ended David's life. But later, according to forensic pathologist Dr. Alexander Kolar, it was the psychological trauma, the stress of being bound, helpless and utterly alone, that triggered a fatal heart attack. David was found lying on the floor, his arms untied but still crossed behind him. This implication was chilling. It looked like, due to the position of the body and the rigor mortis that had left his arms held almost in the same position, meant that his killer must have returned. The room was left ransacked. Drawers were still open, belongings still scattered across the floor. David had passed away in silence, and he'd remained there for days, more than a week. Only when his brother grew worried, after David had failed to return calls and he missed a family birthday, did anyone come looking. But by then, the damage was already done. When the man broke into David Vlow's home on November the 3rd, he didn't bring a weapon to defend himself. He didn't have to because he knew who his victim was. Instead, he brought what he needed to control someone, a sharp kitchen implement, cable ties, and the knowledge that David, elderly, healthy but still fragile, and living alone, had almost nobody checking in on him day to day. And to make all of this worse, the man that broke in had already attempted to break in once before, so David was very carefully targeted. The thing about routine is that they become almost invisible until they cease to happen. David Vlow had gone to Asda the day before he vanished. CCTV captured him slowly navigating the aisles, picking up his regular groceries. This footage was eventually shown during the trial, and for his nieces Claire and Helen Louise, it was almost too much to bear. He was the kindest, gentlest soul you could ever meet, Claire said. He didn't care for expensive things, he just lived a simple life. The camera showed him waiting in line at the checkout. He paid in cash, and then he walked back home the same way that he always did. For his family, seeing that footage was both comforting and crushing. It was the last known moment that David Vlow was free, the last time that anybody saw him alive. They remembered how he never forgot a birthday, how he never missed a phone call, how he was a quiet, consistent presence until he wasn't. When his niece didn't receive a birthday card that November, it was the first red flag. But it would still be another week before his brother contacted the neighbours, and another day before police broke down the door. At that moment, the groceries were still left untouched. They were unpacked, but David had never even made it to the fridge. On the night of the event, the man tied David to the chair and threatened him mercilessly to force him to reveal his bank card PIN. The man didn't panic, nor did he rush out. In fact, he even took the time to cut the phone lines before leaving. Then he walked away, knowing that David had no way to get help. Over the following days, the man and multiple others used the card to drain David's account, but I'll share more on that in a minute. The burglar didn't find David's house by accident. He'd been watching David's every move. He'd also tried to get in more than once. The first attempt was on the night of October the 24th, when at around 10:30 p.m, David heard a window smash. Panicked, he turned on the lights and dialed 999. When officers arrived, they found signs of forced entry, but nobody at the scene. It was written off as an attempted burglary. The police boarded up the broken window by the back door. But this was more than just an attempt, it was really a test. The man had now scouted out the property, seen how easy it was to access, and he was not about to give up, because something he'd seen in that house made the risk worth it. Inside David's account was nearly £19,000, and the man knew that the only thing standing between him and that money was a man that he believed he could overpower. He figured out that David was alone. So, 10 days later, in the early hours of November the 3rd, he came back to the house that David Vlow had lived in his entire life. On the night of the second burglary, his wrists and ankles were bound tightly with phone cord and cable ties. He was left without access to food or water. But for the man, being left helpless was crucial. If David couldn't call anyone, if the bank couldn't reach him or he couldn't reach the bank, then the withdrawals wouldn't trigger suspicion. According to the prosecution, this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was deliberate and cruel, calculated to keep David alive just long enough to give up his PIN, but not long enough to ruin their plan. Detective Superintendent Sean Edwards later said, the motives were purely greed. He wanted to steal, and he didn't care what he had to do to get it. The man looked his victim in the eye, walked out the door, and made the conscious decision to let time finish what he had started. Even if David had survived for hours or days, the inevitable outcome would still be the same. David had been made invisible, and the only person who knew where he was didn't care at all. From November the 3rd to November the 11th, David Vlow existed in a kind of suspended horror. Meanwhile, his life savings were being drained fast. His bank card was being used across the West Midlands. £250 here, £550 there. In total, over £8,000 was stolen. And it wasn't just the burglar that was spending this money. He'd given the card and the PIN to others. He was sharing the spoils of a man who, for all they knew, might still have been breathing, still tied to the chair, as everything he'd worked for was being stripped away. On the night of November the 11th, 9 days after leaving David tied to the chair, the man came back. But this time he wasn't alone. He brought a man named O'Shea Swan, and together they entered through the same broken window. They walked past the same ransacked drawers, and they found what they knew they'd find. David was now no longer breathing, so they released him from his restraints. The pair untied the body and let him fall to the floor. David's arms ended up almost crossed behind his back. Nearby, investigators later found a discarded weapon, the one used to threaten him, and his belongings had been disturbed once again. A second bank card was taken, but that card was out of date. A very, very small mercy. However, this didn't stop them from trying to use it. What the burglar didn't realise was just how much forensic evidence he was leaving behind. The phone cable that was used to bind David carried his DNA. So did the handle of the sharp implement, and a pair of scissors left at the scene. The man wore no gloves. He used no bleach to try and clean up. In fact, it seemed that there was no effort whatsoever to cover his tracks. Digital forensics helped too. Police traced the CCTV footage of the cash withdrawals to the same man. He was caught on camera selling a golden bangle that he had purchased using David's money at a cash converters in Stafford. Phone data showed contact with O'Shea Swan at around the same time. By the time officers matched all the pieces together, they knew exactly who had been inside that house and when. David may have met his end in silence, but almost everything was still recorded by a trail of evidence. The DNA found at the scene was matched to a man, a career criminal named Idris Mohammed. He was arrested for the crimes. In court, Mohammed denied everything. He told the jury that he'd never tied anyone up. He claimed that someone else had asked him to help with removal work. He even suggested that he might have been set up. But would those in court believe him? During the trial at Birmingham Crown Court, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Mohammed's DNA was on the bindings. His face appeared on cash point cameras. And it seems his story didn't just fall apart, but it never even made sense to begin with. David Vlow was not just the victim. He was a brother, an uncle, and as his family described him, the loveliest, most caring person you could ever meet. His nieces, Claire Day and Helen Louise Vlow, spoke at length about what made David special. He lived simply. He didn't chase material things. He just enjoyed the small routines of life. His weekly trip to Asda, keeping in touch with family, watching television from his chair. And that's what made this crime so cruel. He didn't deserve this, Claire said. No one does, but especially not someone like him. In court, they were shown CCTV footage of David on his final grocery run. It was truly painful to watch, but in a way it also brought some comfort. To see him for that one last time was hard, Helen Louise said, but nice. She added, "You sometimes don't realise that a little journey to Asda might be the last one that you do." The family has made it clear they are grateful for the verdict. They thank the jury, they thank the detectives on the case, but they will never forgive Idris Mohammed. No punishment could ever be enough for what he's done, they said. David didn't just die, he died alone, and that's something we will carry forever. Co-defendant O'Shea Swan was also found guilty of burglary and fraud for his role in returning to the scene and using the stolen card. He received 6 years behind bars, but it was Mohammed's sentencing that brought the courtroom to a standstill. Judge Melbourne Inman QC addressed him directly. "You intended to kill him by leaving him immobile without food or water. Mr. Vlow must have been terrified. He must have pleaded with you not to leave him in that position, and that is exactly what you did." He added, "You knew he wouldn't be found for days. You left him helpless, and you did it for money." Idris Mohammed was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 33 years. He showed no emotion. There was no sign of remorse, and not a single word of regret. Justice finally was done, but for David's family, could this ever be enough? Tony McLaughlin had been asleep for just under 2 hours when Aaron first tried to reach her. Her phone vibrated quietly on the bedside table. 1:47 a.m. and then again 1:48 a.m. Tony didn't hear either of them. Then the messages came later. Aaron had once been a regular customer, buying illicit substances from Tony and her boyfriend Robert, who was also Alicia's father. But this arrangement had fallen apart months earlier after a petty falling out, and Tony hadn't spoken to him since. She would later say that she had no idea why Aaron was trying to contact her that night. But we would later discover that his timing wasn't just strange, it was actually chilling. Callum McPhail's alarm went off just after 6 a.m. He was due to start work early and had a quiet routine. Kettle on, boots by the back door, check on the sleeping household. But today, something was off. The door to Alicia's bedroom, usually shut, but today it was slightly ajar. He peered in, and the bed was empty. As he started checking through the rest of the home, he saw that she wasn't in the bathroom, nor on the sofa, not curled up under a blanket after waking up early. Callum's chest began to tighten. Quickly, the whole family tore through the home, calling her name. They checked everywhere, under beds, inside wardrobes, out into the garden. There they saw her bike and scooter sat untouched. Angela King, Alicia's grandmother, grabbed the phone and dialed 999 at 6:23 a.m. She then made a public Facebook appeal just moments later. Has anyone seen our granddaughter? She's only 6. Please, please help. Angela would later describe watching an ambulance rush past their home, towards the hotel ruins in the hills. In that moment, she felt her stomach sink. If that's my granddaughter up there, Callum told officers, then I want to know. The day before had been almost perfect. She spent it doing the things that she loved, playing at the park, paddling in the sea, laughing on the ferry home from a birthday party that wasn't even hers. She'd made a new friend and chased a balloon along the beach until it popped. She stole a slice of pizza from her dad's plate with a giggle. She was on the Isle of Bute for the first half of her summer holiday, staying with her father, Robert, his girlfriend, Tony, and her grandparents in their seafront flat along Ardbeg Road. That night, Alicia was playful and hyper. Perhaps it was the sugar from the party. She was annoying her grandpa Callum by bouncing on his bed and hitting him with a deflating balloon. And she ended that evening the same way that she always did, with a cuddle. "Good night, Grandpa," she said, and she was tucked in at around 10:30 p.m, and the Peppa Pig DVD was left on. By sunrise, the entire island was looking for her. Locals walked the shoreline. Volunteers from the Butte Resilience Team knocked on doors. A Coast Guard helicopter hovered over rooftops. Angela King's Facebook post spread quickly, and within just minutes, George Williams, who lived near the abandoned Kyle's Hydropathic Hotel, read the status and then joined the search. He walked the wooded path behind his home towards the overgrown hotel ruins, and there, at 8:54 a.m, the search was over. In the trees, lying on her side in the dirt, was that small, fragile body, with no clothing. George crouched down and checked for a pulse. Then he stood trembling and dialed 999. His words, "I found the wee girl. She's dead." Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by the first police unit. Detectives quickly confirmed the unthinkable. This was Alicia. They later calculated the walk from her bed to this location would take just 15 to 17 minutes. When police examined the soles of her feet, they found no marks, no dirt, and no damage. So this meant that she hadn't walked to her final location. Instead, she must have been carried. At Rothersay police station, a quiet room had already been prepared. A uniformed officer closed the door behind them. "We found her, but she has passed. She was just 900 metres away, found lying on her side."
What I can say is that I confirm now that the body recovered at Ardbeg Road is that of Alicia McPhail, who was reported missing around about 6:25 on Monday the 2nd of July. What I can say now is that we are treating her death as a murder investigation.
When the news spread, everybody seemed to get up and start running about. So I think it was just at that time in the mornings, you know what I mean, where people were waking up or just going to work and realising what had happened.
A wee bit later, we get word that the body had been found. We were still kind of hoping for the best, but she was still alive and that, and then we found that she was dead a wee bit later. It just shocked everybody.
Pathologist Dr. John Williams would later describe 117 injuries, some likely caused by vegetation in passing, but some not. There were signs of smothering, pressure to the face and neck. There had been blunt strikes, and then no real attempt to hide her. Her innocence had been destroyed and then discarded, right there in the woods. And the person that had done this had already gone back home, washed the red off their hands, and gone back to bed. It was past midnight on the 3rd of July, barely 24 hours since Alicia had been found. This is when Jeanette Campbell reviewed her footage. At first, she had helped to search just like everyone else. She'd assumed that Aaron, her son, was just another worried local teen. She even asked him directly if he knew anything. His response was, "There's no way they'd find my DNA, because I've been nowhere near that wee girl." Still though, something nagged at the mother. This led her to searching through her CCTV feed from the cameras that were mounted on their home, and now a whole new nightmare was about to unfold. She watched Aaron leave at 1:54 a.m, then return at 3:35, before leaving again at 3:44 wearing only shorts. He then returned once more, before leaving again at 3:58, this time in a different outfit. Grey t-shirt, shorts, dark shoes, and a torch in his hand. Finally, he returned for the last time at 4:07 a.m. Each trip was extremely short, which suggests that maybe they were purposeful. Jeanette froze. He had left the house 3 times, during the very hours that Alicia must have vanished, and for some reason her son never mentioned this. The mother now had to decide what to do next. She brought the footage to the police herself. She did this, she would later say, simply to remove him from suspicion. Tony had been the last adult to see Alicia alive just after 11 p.m. She had quietly entered her room to turn off the Peppa Pig DVD. Alicia had already fallen asleep, her face turned gently to the wall. Tony would later describe her in court as peaceful, her hair fanned out across the pillow, breathing softly, still. She whispered goodnight and then closed the door, and off she went to her own bed. Then, just hours later, when she saw those missed calls, she didn't think much of it. But at 6:29 a.m, as panic swept through the flat, she tried calling Aaron back, but he didn't answer. At 9:01 a.m, his response came, "Sorry, doesn't matter," with 2 laughing emojis. And then when she told him that Alicia was missing, he replied, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far. Kiss." But sadly, she had. Aaron Campbell had hosted the kind of party that could only really happen in a small island town. There were 15 teenagers packed into a modest home, the cheap cider was flowing, and smoke from the devil's lettuce was wafting out the windows. And then, by midnight, the last guest had left, all except one. A friend returned at 12:30 a.m, and they found Aaron alone in bed looking off. He was curled up, eyes wide, saying that he felt surreal. He just had a big argument with his mother, so big in fact that furniture had been broken. There had been a lot of yelling. He said that he just needed to clear his head, said that he just wanted to get stoned. Aaron started messaging people, 3 in total, asking if anyone had any green. This included Robert McPhail and Tony McLaughlin. Just to reiterate, Tony was not Alicia's mother, but she was the partner of Robert, who was Alicia's father. Nobody that he sent a message to replied, but by then his decision had already been made. By the next day, forensics teams had found his DNA on Alicia's neck, face and clothing. The odds of it being anyone else were 1 in a billion. The courtroom was still. Aaron Campbell took the stand himself. He was calm and articulate. He appeared to be unshaken by the whole thing. He told the jury that he had never even met Alicia, that he was out looking for his lost phone, that he had slept with Tony McLaughlin that night, his ex-dealer's girlfriend, and that she had done this to Alicia out of jealousy. He said that she had used a discarded prophylactic from their encounter to plant his DNA on the child's body. Tony broke down during testimony. I loved her to pieces, she said of Alicia. And Angela King, Alicia's grandmother, described the relationship between the two as great. The prosecution asked Aaron if he understood what it meant to accuse an innocent person of such a crime. Aaron replied without hesitation, it would be evil. All eyes in the courtroom were on him. He met the prosecutor's gaze, steady and expressionless. It had taken days to present all the evidence. The CCTV, the DNA, the fibre analysis, digital records, Snapchat videos and chilling old messages. But this one single moment, was the trial's clearest window into who he really was. And by the end of it, the jury didn't take long. They deliberated for just 3 hours and made a unanimous decision. He was guilty of abduction. He was guilty of the violation. He was guilty of murder.
Today it was revealed that the 16-year-old who killed her was on the radar of police and social services. Alicia's family is now demanding to know why Aaron Campbell was allowed to slip through the net.
Something could have been done, that there could have been further action taken to make sure that this never happened. It hurts quite a lot, and on top of that, I don't want anything like this to happen to anyone else.
Alicia's family only found out services were involved because of this leaked report. It's Argyll and Bute Council's review of the case, published 6 months ago. It shows Aaron Campbell had been referred to the Youth Justice Service twice, and he was being monitored. But the review says he had not reached their threshold for harmful behaviours protocol.
It hurts knowing the fact that they took a look at this person, said, oh, well, we don't think he's that bad yet. It then took the life of my niece for them then to turn around and go, well, maybe we do need to review it. At that point in time, they failed at their job and they've also failed in their community.
A statement from the Council's Health and Social Care Partnership says, we went beyond what's required from an initial review and carried out a thorough multi-agency assessment of what happened. This robust process has evidence that a crime of this nature could not have been foreseen. How do you feel your family's been treated?
Shockingly.
The judge described the crimes as some of the most wicked and evil that he had ever seen. And this wasn't over yet, because after the verdict, there was still even more to come. Aaron Campbell would eventually speak openly, not to the police nor in the courtroom, but to a forensic psychologist, Dr. Gary McPherson, in a post-trial interview ahead of sentencing. It was a chilling encounter. Aaron described how, when he saw Alicia sleeping, he felt a moment of opportunity. All I thought about was killing her, he said. He admitted absolutely everything, carrying her out to the flat, lying to her when she asked him who he was, then disgustingly violating her before ending her time on this earth. He also described returning to the scene when he realised that he'd dropped his phone and needed to find it. When asked about how he felt about what he'd done, Aaron replied that he was quite satisfied with the murder. He added that it had taken everything to stop laughing during parts of the trial. The psychologist noted that Aaron still experienced fantasies about harming others. This included minors and included those who had already passed.
You gave her your top because she was cold. I will not go into the horrific and cold-blooded details of what you said you did to her, but you explained that after you murdered Alicia, you threw your stained clothing into the sea, had a shower, and then went back where you left her to retrieve your phone. Dr. McPherson reports that you told him that over the next few days you were totally unconcerned, other than to be mildly amused that the police had not arrested you. The only sentence I can impose on you is detention without limit of time. In addition, you will be subject to the notification provisions of the Offences Act 2003 for an indefinite period. However, I also have to specify a period which must pass before you can apply for release on parole. Whether you will ever be released will be for others to determine. But as matters stand, a lot of work will have to be done to change you before that could be considered. It may even be impossible. The period I select is known as the punishment part of the sentence, and its purpose is to satisfy the requirements of retribution and deterrence. The parole board will deal in due course with the protection of the public. The nature of these appalling offences and what I have read in the reports make it clear to me that reintegration and rehabilitation, while these are important considerations, are remote possibilities, and neither your best interests nor anyone else's will be served by a speedy return to the community. Nonetheless, the punishment part will not be as long as it would have been had you been an adult. Your sentence will run from 6 July 2018. You will be detained without limit of time, and I fixed the punishment part at 27 years. That is all.
On March the 21st, 2019, Judge Lord Matthews sentenced him to life with a minimum term of 27 years. He was 16 years old. This was later reduced on appeal to 24 years. Lord Matthews said that Aaron was a cold, calculating, remorseless and dangerous individual, completely lacking in victim empathy. He stressed that Aaron's claim about Tony McLaughlin had been a travesty of the truth. She is completely innocent, the judge said. Still, Aaron showed no emotion, not even as Alicia's mother, Georgina, shouted at him from across the courtroom. The Isle of Bute never really recovered, not really. A place once seen as safe and scenic became the scene of one of Scotland's most shocking crimes in living history. Alicia's school in Airdrie built a playhouse in her honour. Her classmates helped design it. The public donated £22,000. Her family planted flowers, sang songs and read poems. At her funeral, her uncle called her the brightest thing. Pink ribbons lined the streets. A bubble machine sent soft bubbles into the sky as mourners wept. She had wanted a bubble party for her next birthday, but she would not live to see it. The call came just after 7:30 p.m. Karen answered on instinct. Her phone had already lit up more than a dozen times by the time it had gotten to this point of the day. Most of the calls were from one number that she'd been trying to ignore for months. But this time, she picked up. "I will bring your daughter over," the voice said, gravelly and unsteady. "She's dead." Karen froze. Which one was the voice referring to? She had 4 children. All of them lived with her now. They were safe, or so she thought, under the roof of her new home. After everything they'd endured, Lauren, the eldest at 19, had taken on quite a protector role, helping with her siblings whilst trying to rebuild her own life. The desperate mother screamed into the phone, "Which one? Which one?" But the man wouldn't say. The line then went dead. Karen struggled to breathe. The terrified mother tried to convince herself that this was all a lie, just an empty threat, something meant to hurt, not something that was actually happening. Maybe it was just a scare tactic. After all, he'd used these plenty before. Or maybe one of her girls was with him, upset, but surely not actually gone. She told herself, if he's driving here, she must be okay. Why else would he do it? Just minutes later, the Mercedes pulled up, and Karen's world split in two. She would later testify, "I just knew she wasn't going to make it. The feeling of dread started to come over me, and then I saw her inside the car. It was Lauren, gone." Nigel Moult wasn't living with his family. In fact, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near them. At the time, he was out on bail, awaiting trial for 2 counts of domestic assault against his wife, Karen. The conditions of his bail were clear. He must make no contact with her. He must not visit the house, nor could he turn up at Karen's work. Those orders were issued just months earlier in April of 2021, after Karen reported him to the police, and that wasn't for the first time. Their relationship had been unravelling for years. Karen described it as a slow collapse under the weight of alcohol, violence and control. Nigel was volatile. He was extremely possessive, and he was prone to a fragile temper. According to the prosecution, his entire relationship with his wife, and later with their children, was marked by 3 things: drinking, substance taking, and anger. By late 2021, the couple were now officially estranged. Karen and the children had moved to a new house in West Winch, Norfolk, and they were trying their best to start over. Lauren, now 19, stayed with her mother alongside her younger siblings. She had a job, a boyfriend, and plans. Things weren't perfect, but at least now they were finally quieter and safer. Until, that is, the calls started again. They were from Nigel, from the same number. Sometimes he would leave voicemails, other times he would just hang up. There were always excuses as to why he was contacting her. He said there was something that needed picking up. He had something important to say. But of course, Karen knew better. She rightly chose to ignore them. But Nigel was not a man who handled being ignored very well. In the weeks before January the 23rd, he became more and more persistent. He became more agitated. He began demanding contact with the kids and with Karen, but most of all with Lauren, the daughter who now stood between him and the control that he once held. On January the 23rd, 2022, Nigel Malt spent the day in motion. Just after 6:25 p.m, he arrived outside Karen's workplace. The doors were locked. She didn't come out. He didn't go in. Instead, he just got back in his car, the black Mercedes saloon, and sat outside, repeatedly dialing the landline at Karen's home in West Winch. Lauren and her boyfriend Arthur Marnell were there. The phone rang once, twice. In fact, again and again and again. In total, Nigel made 19 attempted calls between 6:25 p.m. and 6:52 p.m. All of them were rightly ignored. He finally gave up and drove to the house on Leet Way, and there he parked outside. He knocked on the door but nobody answered, so he left and then called again. In fact, another 3 times. Finally, at 7:20 p.m, Lauren picked up the phone. That final call lasted just 66 seconds, and we don't know exactly what was said. But something within that minute made Nigel turn the car around and return to Leet Way, and now he was angry. This time he did not knock on the door. This time he was no longer trying to be let in. According to Arthur, who would later testify, Nigel pulled onto the driveway. He got out the car, and then he began shouting, and he had a crowbar in his hand. Lauren and Arthur had moved outside. Nigel was trying to get at the boyfriend. Lauren stepped in. She told her father to leave. She told him just to go home, and then she stood between them. Nigel didn't get the last word that night, at least not with his voice. Temporarily defeated, he instead got back in the car. He turned the key and pressed his foot to the accelerator. Leet Way was quiet. It was a small residential street in West Winch in Norfolk. There were rows of brick homes, parked cars, not the sort of place where neighbours would expect to hear shouting. Certainly not like this. But just after 7:25 p.m. that Sunday evening, the silence was shattered. Several residents stepped out of their homes when they heard horrifying raised voices. Some of them already knew who Nigel Malt was. One neighbour even started recording a video on their phone, and what they saw was a confrontation. Nigel was shouting, he was slurring his words. He was waving something about in his hands, which turned out to be the metal crowbar. Arthur, Lauren's boyfriend, kept his distance, but Lauren was no longer scared. Witnesses could hear her yelling, clearly and firmly, for her father to leave. "Go home," she said. "Leave us alone." Lauren bravely stood her ground. She blocked the path between her father, Arthur, and the house. And for a moment it did work. Nigel lowered the crowbar, turned around and walked back towards his car. It looked like he was finally giving up, ready to just drive away into the night. However, he didn't leave, at least not straight away. Nigel instead got into the driver's seat, he shut the door, turned on the ignition, and then shifted the car into reverse. At first, nobody moved. In fact, nobody could believe what they were seeing. Lauren remained behind the vehicle. She was close to the bumper, watching. The engine revved, and then came the first thud. The car jolted. Someone shouted from a doorway, "You've killed her. You've f***ing killed her." Nigel now stopped. Silence fell over the scene, and then he shifted gears once again, this time pulling forwards, and then he pressed down on the pedal hard. Most of what happened that night outside the house was witnessed. In fact, some of it was recorded. It captured Nigel yelling from his driver's seat, "Lauren, get up, please." But Lauren did not get up. That's because she couldn't. She was now beneath the car. The recordings captured something else too, something more haunting than words alone. You could hear groaning, the unmistakable sound of someone in pain, someone desperate, injured, trapped. And then there was another burst of movement. The Mercedes rolled forward once again, but this time it didn't seem to be in panic. This time it was deliberate. One witness described this later as like someone finishing the job. When the car finally stopped, the groaning noise stopped with it. Neighbours screamed from their doorsteps. One person shouted to call the police. But what Nigel did next made everything so much worse. He got out of the car, he bent down, and then picked Lauren up off the floor and placed her into the passenger side of the car. She could not sit fully upright, she just crumpled in the space. She fell, bending awkwardly into the footwell beneath the dashboard. Then Nigel shut the door, he got behind the wheel once more and drove off into the night. Nigel did not go to the police, he did not call for an ambulance, he did not drive to the hospital to try and save his daughter. Instead, he drove back to Karen, and when she saw what he'd done, she couldn't even scream. She just stared and whispered her daughter's name. When this case hit the courtroom and the footage was played for those present and the pathologist's report was laid bare, there was no room for denial of what had happened here. Lauren Moult did not meet her end in an accident. She didn't collapse due to medical issues. She wasn't simply clipped by a reversing car in poor light. She was run over twice, on purpose. And the terrifying sequence of events was confirmed by multiple witnesses, by CCTV footage, by mobile phone footage and forensic evidence. Nigel Moult reversed into her, knocking her to the ground. He paused, then reversed further, crushing her body beneath the wheels. He stopped and then drove forwards over the body another time. This caused catastrophic injuries. In fact, a post-mortem examination found crushing injuries to her chest, her abdomen, head, arms and legs. Her back was broken, pelvis shattered. She had internal injuries and multiple rib fractures. She was, however, alive after the first impact. She may have even still been conscious, but after the second, she couldn't move even if she wanted to. She could no longer draw in breath, and the prosecution called this deliberate. The weapon in this case was a black Mercedes saloon used with purpose in an alcohol-fueled rage in a residential street. And Nigel's defense, he said he didn't see her behind the car. He said he thought that he'd hit a wheelie bin. He said that the whole thing was just an accident. But even he couldn't explain the second pass, nor why he moved her body, but failed to call emergency services, or why he called Karen and said, "I'll bring your daughter over, she's dead," because by then he knew exactly what he'd done, and he just kept making things worse. Nigel Moult was sentenced to life in prison. Originally, the minimum term was set at 18 years, but the sentence was later deemed as unduly lenient, and it was then increased to 22 years by the Court of Appeal. Still, for Karen Moult, the courtroom didn't offer closure. For something like this, I don't think it ever could. Reading her statement aloud, she described the moment that her ex-husband pulled up at her workplace, how she peered inside and saw her daughter stuffed in the footwell. She said, "Seeing her in that position for me was worse than knowing that she had been run over. I tried to move her into the seat. He didn't help. He just stood there. I can't fathom how a parent could kill their own child." And then just one final question, spoken to no one in particular. How do you forgive? And there was really no answer. The question met with silence. This is the kind of grief that will never go away. In the years after his conviction, Nigel Moult was transferred to HMP Gartree, a Category B prison in Leicestershire, and there, in early 2025, his time on this earth came to an end in custody. No cause has been publicly confirmed, and a spokesperson for the prison service stated only that, as with all deaths in custody, the Prison and Probation Ombudsman will investigate. Nigel was 47 years old. There was no public statement from the family. And now, frustratingly, there is no further justice to be served. Emily Jean Schwartz had a way of standing out. She was the girl that ran around in polka dot pants and a striped shirt dancing. Her stepmother Prudy recalled. She was always very happy. She absolutely loved to sing. She was a good singer. Her friends remembered her for her love of sparkly things. Her cat Oreo, her dog Remy, and summer days at Hampton Beach with her best friend Lauren. Her mother Adrienne described her as a beautiful, aspiring singer whose hope and determination to survive shone brightly. Emily earned her LNA license and found joy in caring for others, but she had dreams of becoming a cosmetologist, a way of helping people feel good about themselves, even when she sometimes struggled to feel that way about herself. She loved adventures, camping, trips, hiking, rock climbing, and trips to Acadia with her family. But in private, there were shadows. Her mother said she'd seen bruises and scratches on her daughter. There were stories about arguments. Arguments had escalated into physical confrontations. Emily sometimes downplayed them. Sometimes she asked for help. But she always went back to Joseph. The weekend before the trip to Vermont, Adrienne said she felt something that she couldn't shake off. I froze. There was a very strong, overwhelming feeling that my life was in danger from him. I wasn't correct that it was my life. It was my daughter's. In the Burlington courtroom, prosecutor Sarah George held Joseph's written statement in her hand. "You told police you went to get breakfast the morning after Emily died," she asked. "Yes," Joseph replied. "You didn't tell them you went to the police immediately because you were scared for your life." "No." She reminded the jury of what he'd also admitted, that after breakfast he'd moved the van with Emily's body still inside it. "Does that sound like self-defense to you?" she asked pointedly. Joseph's eyes stayed low. He said, "I wasn't thinking clearly." But Prosecutor George's tone never softened. She pressed on inconsistencies. The claim that Emily might have had a firearm, even though it was later found under his control. The garbage bag that was found over her head. Every answer seemed to sink him further. From the jury box, one juror scribbled down notes. Another leaned back and crossed their arms. The story Joseph was telling now was not the one that he told police in October of 2021, and George was trying her best to make sure that the jury noticed. The man who broke this case open was not a detective. It was just after midnight on October the 19th, 2021, when Vermont 911 dispatchers took a call from a man named Spencer Lemons. His voice was tense. He said his friend Joseph Alazzo had just confessed to killing his wife. And right then, barely any time had passed. He said it happened that weekend. Spencer told them Joseph said that her remains were still inside the camper van, and that van was now parked at a residence on Meadowbrook Lane in St Albans town. Joseph had just been riding in Spencer's Jeep when the conversation turned downright chilling. Spencer said that he then kicked Joseph out of the car and called 911 immediately, and very quickly state police located the camper van. The search warrant would come later, but for now, they had in their possession a very possible murder scene, a missing 22-year-old woman, and a suspect who had just put himself at the center of it all. But what they didn't have yet was the truth. On Monday, October the 18th, Joseph showed up at Adrienne and David Bass's home, situated in New Hampshire. He was without Emily. He told them that the couple had argued in a parking lot in Bolton. Emily, he said, got out and just walked away, and that she planned to take an Uber home. He claimed that he couldn't find her when he returned. Mother Adrienne did not believe it. Who waits 2.5 days to even tell anybody their significant other is missing? Stepmother Prudy later asked. When Joseph handed over Emily's license, Adrienne thought it was odd. At the time, she assumed that his strange shivering was from riding a motorcycle in October, but later she came to believe that it was anxiety from lying to their faces. She remembered the moment that he left the house. She thought he seemed threatening and cold, that this was an unspoken warning not to question him. But by that evening, Adrienne and David had reported Emily missing. They told police about the history of DV, about the bruises that they'd seen, about how Emily sometimes reached out for help, but then frustratingly returned to Joseph anyway. At that point, Emily had been gone for 3 days. The family still hoped that she'd simply left, that she'd had enough of the whole situation, and that they might receive a phone call from somewhere safe. But in reality, Emily's family had seen the signs long before this anniversary trip. Her mother recalled seeing scratches and bruises. Friends noticed her energy shifting and her confidence dim. But Emily was loyal, sometimes to her own detriment, and she just could not break it off. There had been notable physical altercations. This included one on New Year's Eve just months before the trip. Emily had even begun divorce paperwork at one point, but the process was stalled. Mother Adrienne said that Emily would come to them for help, only to then share everything with Joseph afterwards, so that made having conversations dangerous. We had to speak in coded language, stepfather David remembered. The mother's gut told her that something was really very wrong. I felt, as a mom, my daughter was not safe, she said, but nothing that they tried could convince Emily to walk away for good. And then, on October the 15th, 2021, she got into that van with Joseph for what was supposed to be a romantic getaway. By the morning of October the 19th, police received that call from Spencer Lemon that turned the entire investigation. When authorities turned up to the driveway in St Albans town, nearly 60 miles away from Bolton, parked there was a Chevrolet Express bus with curtains drawn tight. Detectives secured a search warrant and opened up the van. Inside the small bathroom, they found 8 plastic garbage bags. One of them was partially opened. Inside it was a leg, still wearing pants. In another compartment, police found a firearm. Behind the driver's seat lay a handsaw. Shreds of evidence still clung to it. The next step was finding Joseph. By sheer coincidence, a state trooper spotted him inside a Maple Fields convenience store. He agreed to go with investigators to the barracks. Once there, Joseph began to talk. Every word that he spoke confirmed what police had already begun to piece together. Back to the beginning of this final weekend, October the 15th, 2021, Emily and Joseph packed their converted Chevrolet Express bus for a fun weekend in Vermont. It was meant to be a celebration, their first wedding anniversary. They would meet Joseph's sister and her boyfriend. They were staying in an Airbnb at Bolton Valley Resort. Emily sent videos to her family of the scenic drive through the Green Mountains. And that evening, they chatted with Joseph's sister outside the van. At 9:39 p.m, Joseph sent a text message to her. "Hey, we're going to take the night to rest. You still drink coffee? We'll see you tomorrow morning." But inside the van that night, the conversation between husband and wife turned into an argument once again. Joseph would later claim that Emily hit and kicked him, and then she went to lay down on the bed. He says he sat in silence for several minutes, and according to his own account, he then grabbed a firearm from the cabinet, jumped on top of her, placed a pillow over her face, and then inflicted 2 blasts. Emily now lay motionless. Joseph put the garbage bag over her head and moved her body to the van's bathroom. The rest of that night passed in silence. He told them that he'd gone to breakfast with his sister the next morning. Then he'd driven a van to St Albans, where about 12 to 15 hours after the event, he dismantled Emily's body with the handsaw and then placed her into bags. No one outside of that camper van knew that Emily, who had been laughing with family just hours earlier, was now wiped from existence.
Lauren, a difficult evening here tonight as friends and family are learning this is no longer a missing persons case, but rather a homicide investigation. Vermont State Police say Joseph Ferlazzo admitted to them that he killed Emily inside of that vehicle in Bolton. In fact, they say he's provided a wealth of information into what may have happened here. This is video from outside the police barracks. There was a lot of movement here around 7:30. VSP's major crime unit vehicle was stationed. There was also what appears to be a converted camper bus nearby. Now, important to mention, I just spoke with Emily's stepmother, Prudy Schwartz, moments ago. Something she did not hesitate to tell me is that she knew something was off when it came to Emily's husband, Joseph Ferlazzo, even though she only met him just one time. She says even Emily's behavior was not like the Emily she knew once she got with him.
Something didn't click the first time. We met him and he wasn't sure what it was about him, but he did not like him. And I said, it's something with his eyes.
Now, when I asked Emily's stepmother, her relationship with Emily, she tells me it was weird to even hear the word stepdaughter or stepmother because she's been a mother to Emily for the past 20 years.
John and Alyssa, Emily's loved ones tell me it's been a difficult 2 years, but they know more challenging days lie ahead as prosecutors prep for what's expected to be an emotional trial for Joseph Ferlazzo. While they wait, though, memories of Emily stay in focus.
A contagious personality with a beautiful singing voice.
New songs will come up and we're like, oh, we could totally imagine Emily, singing that not only in the car, but just in a room full of people or friends and around a campfire.
Kathy Eckelberger is a longtime family friend whose daughters were Emily's best friends. She says Emily was a licensed nursing assistant, passionate about cosmetology, loved sparkles, and Hampton Beach in New Hampshire.
She had this infectious laugh.
But that laughter was silenced a little more than 2 years ago. Movement on the case has been slow. Anxiety has been high, and unsettling reminders stick with the family.
And the family is holding on to his belongings. We can't do anything with him until he's prosecuted. We want to be able to get on and remember Emily without having to think about him and waiting for a trial, knowing that that's going to come up and it's going to rip open more Band-Aids.
Eckelberger says Emily's loved ones were aware she was in an abusive relationship and had spoken with her about it, but know how challenging it is for survivors to leave a relationship with their abuser.
5 days into the trial, the jury heard about the gunshot residue, about the recovered Glock, and about the 8 garbage bags pulled from the bathroom of the camper van. Now they were watching Joseph. He leaned forward as his defense attorney asked him to explain, in his own words, what happened that night in October of 2021. He spoke slowly, framing it all as a moment of survival. She was hitting and kicking me, he said. I thought she had the gun, but he couldn't say for sure. Instead, he painted the image of lying in bed while Emily lay nearby, with the fight supposedly being over. Then a blur, a single frame of memory, where his hand held a sharp implement and the cold metal met her skin. The prosecution just let the silence hang before cross-examination.
In October of 2021, Mr. Ferlazzo and his wife Emily made a plan to come to Vermont for a weekend for their 1-year anniversary. You heard from Emily's mother that Emily was excited. She was looking forward to meeting her sister-in-law, Nicole. She was in a good mood and she was looking forward to the trip. They drove up here in their van with their dog from New Hampshire on the evening of Friday, October 15th of 2021. They arrived in Vermont at the Bear Run condos at 7:20 p.m. They parked at a condo complex on Bear Run in Bolton. They met with Nicole for about 15 minutes out in the parking lot inside the van, with a plan for Mr. Ferlazzo and Emily to meet them inside the Airbnb to catch up, watch Netflix, and hang out. But they never did. And we know that Emily sent her last Facebook message to her family at 8:13 p.m. We know that Mr. Ferlazzo sent a text message to his sister Nicole inside the Airbnb at 9:39 p.m. Hey, We're gonna take the night to rest, smiley face. You still drink coffee? We'll see you tomorrow morning. Shortly after, Emily's last location data from her Facebook is logged as 10:14 p.m. Instead of going inside and spending time with his sister, Mr. Ferlazzo and Emily argued. They argued because Mr. Ferlazzo had brought Emily on their 1-year anniversary to the very same condo complex that his ex-wife lived. They argued because Mr. Ferlazzo seemed to believe that he didn't have any obligations to be monogamous with his wife, be faithful to her, and she told him she was done. She told him she did not want to be with him, that she could not do it anymore, and that she wanted to leave. And 1 minute after midnight, Mr. Ferlazzo turns off his phone. Done arguing, Emily laid down in bed while Mr. Ferlazzo stayed up and stewed. He became enraged at Emily while she lay in bed scrolling on her phone with her head on her pillow. Mr. Ferlazzo sat on the couch thinking, planning. But instead of walking away from Emily, going into his sister's Airbnb, out of the van, instead he executes his plan. He got up from the couch, he went to the closet, he grabbed this Glock 19 with this silencer. He walked over to the bed. Emily's head was resting on this pillow. He picked up this throw pillow from the couch. He jumped onto the bed. He put this throw pillow over her face, and he shot her once and twice, directly into the left side of her head. And he again sleeps in the van with Emily's body still in the shower. And the next day, he goes out to Burlington with his sister. He gets coffee, and again, he goes out to eat. And again, he says nothing to Nicole about what he did to Emily. And after gallivanting around downtown, he heads back to St. Albans, and on his way, he stops at Hannaford to buy bleach. Because despite him continuing with his life as if nothing has happened, he does have a mess to clean up. He decides that he needs to make her body easier to carry, easier to move, and easier to discard. Mr. Ferlazzo uses this serrated saw and dismantles her arms, her legs, her feet, and her head from her torso. The same torso, absolutely riddled with wounds, including one striking her heart. 3 different knives had her DNA on them. At least 3 different knives were used to her heart 1 time, her abdomen 8 times, and her back 9 times. Then he puts each piece of her body.
Prosecutor George stood and pressed him on every detail. Which came first? When he aimed at her head, followed by the blasts, or the sharp implement? Why did he tell police about the garbage bag? Why still go and meet his sister for breakfast the next morning, if this had just been a moment of desperate self-defense? Joseph answered, but not convincingly. From the gallery, Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass, watched the jury's faces. She would later say, "I didn't believe they were buying it. I could see them lining up what he was saying with the forensic evidence, and it wasn't matching." However, whether this was enough for an actual conviction is another matter. On December the 13th, 2024, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Joseph Ferlazzo guilty of first-degree murder.
It's been 3 years since Joseph Ferlazzo killed his wife, Emily Jean, while the couple celebrated their 1-year wedding anniversary in Bolton. This morning, the jury listening to a portion of Ferlazzo's testimony for a second time. We heard around 50 minutes where he recounts the events leading up to, during, and after he killed Emily Jean. He says he feared Emily Jean was going to kill him and argues he acted in self-defense.
All I remember is feeling like three things. It was I felt like it was boom boom boom, and it was 2 shots, and then her body dropping.
And after hearing the testimony, it took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a guilty verdict. Emily's mother saying this verdict is the next best thing to having her daughter with her, and says she feels relief that justice will be served for the man who killed her.
The only thing that can make it better really is to have my daughter back in my arms and alive and breathing and singing and loving life the way that she was.
At this point, Ferlazzo will remain held without bail until his sentencing, and now that he's been found guilty, the state says he faces a minimum of 35 years in prison.
4 months later, Judge Timothy Dooley sentenced him to 42.5 years to life in prison. Emily's mother stood outside the courthouse, with a wait of 3 years finally settling. The verdict couldn't be any better, she said. For me, it was really just relief and feeling like we got the justice that Emily deserves. In Livingston's Deadridge area, the streets filled long before midday. Neighbours, friends, teachers and strangers all came together, their breath hanging in the cold air. The first to arrive brought flowers. Others followed with handmade cards, balloons and soft toys, tucking them into the growing collection near the route. When the horses finally appeared, the crowd paid close attention. Hope's coffin had been decorated with characters from Paw Patrol, the animated series that she so loved. Behind the carriage, a family friend walked dressed as Chase, one of the show's most recognisable characters. The tribute had been suggested by 6-year-old Hope's classmates at Toronto Primary School. There she was known for her bright smile and gentle nature. The hearse followed a car, carrying a Paw Patrol-themed floral arrangement provided by the school itself. It was a gift from the pupils and staff who had been struggling to make sense of what had happened. The piper led the way, every note cutting through the stillness. The sound seemed to travel down each street before the coffin even came into sight. This gave people a moment to prepare themselves. Some bowed their heads, some quietly cried, their tears warm against the freezing air. When the procession reached Addenbrae Cemetery, the path was lined with more flowers. Roses, lilies, daisies, many in yellow and blue. Children stood holding soft toys in their hands, unsure whether to wave or stand still. It was, as the family called it, Hope's Day. A day not for questions, but for just saying goodbye. And yet, in the silence between the bagpipe notes, a question lingered in every mind. How could something like this have happened here? At Toronto Primary, the halls felt quieter. Teachers spoke more softly to the students. Children clutched each other's hands. Head teacher Fiona Linfoot chose her words with care. Hope was a much-loved member of the Toronto Primary family and will be hugely missed by all her friends and school staff. She was a bright, bubbly and affectionate girl who brought joy to everyone she met. We will really miss her infectious smile and kind heart. The quotes were read aloud at a short gathering in the playground. A few pupils nodded along, others just stared at the ground. Many locals had tied blue and yellow ribbons to the fence. They lifted in the wind like small flags. Across town, another message travelled fast. It came from Tess, Hope's aunt. The tragedy that fell upon the hearts and souls of Hope's family, especially her mum, will never be understood or justified. The torment, torture and heartache that we feel will never be able to be described. Not today, not tomorrow, and not in the future. Not only do we feel empty, but the world feels empty too. People read those lines on their phones, screens blurred with tears. Friends sent each other screenshots and small heart emojis. In a situation like this, nobody seemed to know the right thing to say, but the wrong thing would have been just to stay in silence. So they spoke about Hope. They remembered her love for animals. They remembered the way that she beamed when she learned a new word in French. They remembered the little drawings that she scribbled in her notebooks. They remembered the laugh that made you laugh back. And as the day of the procession drew near, something gentle took shape, an unspoken promise that Hope would not make that journey alone. The page went live with a single name, Hope. Beneath it, a message from family friend Melanie Wheeldon. Hope's life was tragically cut short, leaving a void in the hearts of her family and friends that can never be filled. This GoFundMe page has been created to help Hope's family with the unexpected funeral expenses during this incredibly difficult time. People in the local area and beyond shared the link. Donations appeared in just minutes. £5, £10, 20, some gave more. By nightfall, the total had leapt past the first target, and then it just kept on going. It shot past £2,000, and then past £8,500, and then it shot past £10,000. The comments section became a kind of book of remembrance. Some of the comments read, from one Toronto parent to another, for your beautiful girl, with love from a stranger. Candles flickered outside near the route that the carriage would take. Someone placed a soft toy among them. Someone else tucked a hand-drawn chase into the ribbons. A cluster of kids whispered the names of Paw Patrol characters, like a list of small guardians for Hope. Chase, Sky, Marshall. On a nearby wall, a printed statement asked for kindness. Police would speak soon, it said. There would be time for details. But for now, there was a family to hold, a community to steady, and a little girl to carry with dignity along her final road. And behind those candles, behind the donations and the flowers, the same question sat with everyone who stopped to listen. Just how did we get here? And what happened behind that normally quiet door? In West Calder, the silence didn't feel normal. It was the kind that followed shock. It wasn't peace, but a kind of pause. Councillor Craig Meek called it shockwaves, and he wasn't wrong. At the shops, people spoke in lowered voices. Near the school, parents lingered after drop-off, glancing at one another, unsure if they should mention it. Some had brought their children to the vigil. Others had decided they were too young. I mean, how could you explain this? A local mum summed it up in just a few words. You think these things happen somewhere else, not here. And that sentiment passed from mouth to mouth. Lawrence Fitzpatrick, leader of West Lothian Council, described this incident as tragic and deeply upsetting, adding that the whole area felt the loss. We have officers and school staff offering the appropriate support and reassurance at this very difficult time, he said. The visible presence of police cars didn't make it feel any safer. If anything, it made it feel less so. Uniformed officers stood near the cordons. They spoke quietly into their radios, understanding that the eyes of the community were on them. A blue forensic tent had been put up in the garden of the house on Harburn Drive. It was a reminder that somewhere inside that cordon lay the answers to all of the questions that nobody wanted to ask out loud. People were desperate for details, but were dreading them at the same time. The police hadn't yet released the timeline. For now, the only certainty was a noticeable absence, the missing sound of Hope's laughter in the playground, the missing sight of her mum walking her to school, the missing morning where everything might have been different. It was 3 days after the discovery when Chief Superintendent Greg Banks finally stepped up to speak. He called it a shocking and deeply upsetting incident for the families involved, and he said that the impact was felt right across the local community. He thanked residents for their support as officers carried out what he called essential inquiries within the house. Beside him, Detective Superintendent Grant Hendry gave the clearest statement yet, revealing just a little more. Our thoughts remain with Hope's family and friends, along with everyone affected by this tragedy. He added that specialist officers were providing support, and that, at this time, We have no information to suggest anyone else is involved. This meant there would be no manhunt, no list of suspects, but also no clear answers. Hope's father, a man named Mark Gordon, his time on this earth ending was described as unexplained, and Hope's, now confirmed through a post-mortem, was being treated as murder. However, the specific cause was not shared. When pressed by reporters, Hendry repeated that inquiries are at an early stage, and that it would take time to get answers for the family and community.
So local officers attended the scene. It's a traumatic scene that we're processing at the moment, and we're supporting those officers as well ongoing, having seen what they've seen.
What do we know about the victims?
So we can confirm the relationship as father and daughter, and further to that we're supporting both families, and we'll continue to do so as we process and investigate.
Are you looking for anyone else with regards to this?
I confirm that the information we have available at the moment would suggest we're not looking for anyone else at this time.
So that would suggest that perhaps the father has murdered the daughter?
Again, I'm not going to speculate until investigation concludes at the moment, and all options are open at the moment.
I mean, somebody must have seen something. Given the time of day, you know, broad daylight, you would think that something, maybe seen something or heard something.
So we are engaging with the local community and the neighbours in the immediate vicinity. We'll continue to engage with them and thank them for the support so far. And anybody with any information, I'd urge them to come forward to the officers who remain at the scene.
Behind the measured words, it was clear that the case weighed heavily on the officers who had first responded. Hendry admitted that those local officers had faced a traumatic experience on the day that they entered the property. He asked for privacy for the family at that time. He also urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. And then he left without taking any more questions. The unanswered elements lingered in the air, which now felt even heavier, because with every careful statement it became even clearer. Whatever had happened inside that house was something that nobody would want to picture. The night before Hope's Day, the air in Livingston carried a strange mix of anticipation and sorrow. Funeral staff prepared the horse and carriage in quiet stables. Florists worked late, shaping yellow and blue blooms into the Paw Patrol tributes that would follow the hearse. Inside the family home, Margaret, Hope's mother, faced what her friends would describe as her lowest point. There were photographs of Hope at every stage of her short life. A messy-fingered toddler holding a paintbrush, a beaming schoolgirl showing off her spelling test, a bundled figure building a snowman just 2 weeks before. Close friend Melanie Wilden sat with her, talking about the details of the day to come. She told reporters later, if there was any idea that Hope was in danger, she would never have gone to her dad's. Father Mark Gordon had shared custody, and there had been no warning signs as to what was about to happen. In fact, Mark shared this video shortly before the events in this case.
A lot of you out there might be wondering, hey Mark, why are you outside in this blizzard? Well, I'm off to the gym, and you should too, you fat slob. Be kind, God bless.
There was no sign to suggest that he was capable of harm, but now Mother Margaret couldn't bear to hear his name. She wanted her daughter remembered without his shadow. Melanie's fundraiser had been meant to take away the weight of the funeral costs, but instead it became a symbol of something larger. It showed the sheer scale of people who wanted to help carry Hope, if not in body, then in spirit, to wrap their arms around the family. And that night, in homes across West Lothian, parents tucked in their children and lingered just a little longer at the door. Some whispered, "I love you," twice. Some turned back for one more hug. And outside, in the cold, candles were still burning. January the 20th began like any other Monday. Hope should have been in school by 9 a.m, but by mid-morning, her absence was noticed. Toronto Primary tried to make contact, and a family member, concerned, went to check on Mark Gordon's home, situated on Harburn Drive. However, there was no answer at the door, and calls also went unanswered. By 4 p.m, the police were now involved. Officers arrived with urgency but found the property locked. They called the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service for assistance. Neighbours watched as firefighters forced entry. A blue tent was later set up in the garden, and inside the home, officers found the bodies of Hope and Father Mark. What happened between morning and afternoon has not been fully publicly detailed. However, police confirmed that they were not seeking anyone else in connection with the passings. This meant that all of this was done by Mark's hand. Hope's ending was treated as murder. Mark's was unexplained, though not suspicious. So there was an answer, but not the kind that could deliver any healing. In the days that followed, officers went door to door, piecing together movements, calls and last sightings. In a very rare occurrence, police would not say what they had found, just that the details were too much to share. But they did make it clear that the first responders had been through something that no training could have prepared them for. And knowing what emergency services see on a day-to-day basis, the scene must have been truly heinous beyond the imagination. As the investigation continued behind a taped-off doorway, the community began planning something of their own, a farewell worthy of the little girl that they had loved and lost. In the weeks after the funeral, the police presence on Harburn Drive slowly faded. The cordon came down, the blue tent disappeared. Neighbours began parking in the spaces that had been sealed off. However, the house in question still stayed shuttered, its windows reflecting only grey winter skies. Detectives from the major investigation team concluded their inquiries. They confirmed that there would be no charges, because there was nobody left to charge. The Police Investigations and Review Commissioner continued its separate review into the case, a process likely to take months. For the family, those findings, whenever they arrive, would not bring back the little girl with quick wit, the top marks on her maths tests, and the soft spot for Paw Patrol. For the community, it was about holding on to her name without the darkness that took her. The flowers left along the funeral route eventually wilted, the ribbons faded, but the grief remained fresh. And now when people spoke of January the 20th, they didn't talk about what happened on Harburn Drive. They talked about Hope's Day, about white horses and blue feathers, about a crowd that came together even in the bitter cold, about the sound of the piper's tune carrying her home. Scarlett Vickers had been looking forward to the summer holidays. A trip to Gran Canaria was booked, and she'd agreed to get up early the next morning to have breakfast with her relatives. The family lived in a small, close-knit household. It was just her dad Simon, and her mum Sarah Hall. They called themselves the 3 S's. By most accounts, there was no trouble at home. Scarlett's school had no concerns, and police would later find no evidence of discord in the family's phones or messages. Friday, the 5th of July 2024 was nothing unusual. Simon finished work. He smoked a special ciggy, and then he drank some wine whilst watching football on the TV. Mum Sarah cooked spaghetti bolognese in the kitchen. Scarlett spent most of her evening upstairs in her room, but at around 10:15 p.m. she came down. She said that she was bored, and what began as harmless fun would, within just half an hour, leave Scarlett fading fast.
I just want to know how my daughter's doing. We're mucking about playing in the kitchen, and for some reason, this has gone really weird. I mean, we're mucking about. I can't believe this. I don't know what it is. It's just pointless. What? Please, someone tell me. What's going on?
At the minute, mate, we've got no new information.
We're all in Gran Canaria in 6 weeks. I don't believe this happening. We're cooking tea. We're just mucking about in the kitchen. I don't understand how this is happening.
The Vickers' kitchen was small. It had a breakfast bar on one side and the cooker up against the wall. It wasn't unusual for the family to chat or to tease each other whilst dinner was being prepared. And on that night, Scarlett joined in with her mum and dad's back and forth banter. Sarah was still tending to the food, but she played along too. She was tossing grapes at her daughter. Scarlett tossed them back. Father Simon joined in too, laughing when grapes hit the floor, but also warning that they needed to be picked up before the dog got to them. Then the horseplay kind of escalated. There was some tickling. There were some light pinches with a pair of cooking tongs. At one point, Sarah nipped Simon on the backside with them, accidentally catching his finger in the process. "Ow," he said, and Scarlett laughed, adding, "Don't be such a wimp, Dad." The comment, thrown in jest, was one of the last things that she would ever say. According to Simon, what happened next happened in just seconds. From the moment that emergency crews stepped into Geneva Road, Simon Vickers began explaining what had just happened, but he never gave exactly the same explanation twice. However, one thing they had in common is each version of events placed distance between his hand and the weapon at the moment of injury. None of his stories match forensic evidence. Scarlett's mother, Sarah Hall, still with him after 27 years, gave testimony that she believed it was all just an accident. She said they were a happy family, but even her recollections changed under pressure. During the 999 call, she told the operator that they'd been messing about and that her partner threw something and didn't realise. She allegedly told paramedics that they'd been chucking knives. But in court, she said she was in shock and she was not thinking clearly when she made those comments. For the prosecution, the shifting stories were more than confusion. They were signs of a deliberate evasion, of someone shaping their memory in order to avoid the one scenario that the evidence supported, that the implement was in Simon's hand when it entered Scarlett's chest. It was late. The cooking was half done. The football on TV had finished. The wine glasses were on the go. Scarlett had just come down because she was bored, and she wanted to have a laugh. Everyone was messing around together. Because the kitchen was small, everything was within reach. The utensils, the breakfast bar, the cooker. But here is where the stories split off. Simon says that he reached for the tongs. He says he swiped them across the worktop. He says that they clipped the corner. He says that something else must have moved. In another telling, he thought he had the tongs in his hand. In another, it was a sharp kitchen implement that had just been poking out of the side. In yet another story, Scarlett lunged while he was still turning. Sarah then turned back, and she heard her daughter say, "Ow." When she spun around, Scarlett was stood there, stunned, with red already spreading under her pyjama top. It was then that Father Simon grabbed her. He said she started gasping for breath, and that her eyes went like doll's eyes. They say they tried to help her, applying pressure to the wound. The call handler on 999 was counting the beats for CPR, and then the sirens were coming fast, but not fast enough. The room just moments earlier had been a family living in a bubble, a private language of in-jokes and nicknames, the 3 S's. Now it was a murder scene. Now the house was evidence. Simon would later tell police, "I must be responsible." He would say it could only be a freak accident. He would insist there was no sharp implement in any equation, but the cut to Scarlett's top, the path it took between the fabric, the depth inside her chest, all of it would be measured, all of it would be shown, because whatever anyone said they remembered in shock, the physics of it will never forget. Forensic pathologist Dr. Jennifer Bolton examined the injury. Her findings became the spine of the case. Scarlett's injury tracked between 2 ribs. It went through part of the left lung and then into the left ventricle of the heart. It was approximately 11 centimeters in depth, one single entry, no retained blade. To reach that far, Dr. Bolton said, the sharp kitchen implement had to be held, and it had to be held tightly. The father's arm must have braced, a firm grip at the moment of contact. So could a thrown utensil do this? Practically impossible, she told the court. Kitchen tools aren't designed to fly true, they tumble, they strike at bad angles. For something like this free flying, to pierce the fabric, and then to pierce a chest that deep, it would need to arrive at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. No snagging, no bounce. Straight through a fluffy nightgown layer, through a top, through her bra, and then another 11 centimetres. Even then, the clothing would likely just deflect it, or it would perhaps skate across, leaving a scratch. It would not drive a channel into the chest cavity. A forensic scientist, Gemma Escott, inspected the utensil. Material patterns suggested a direct thrust, not a ricochet, not a glancing strike. Dr. Bolton added that only mild force was needed with a steady hand. This is because, once the point found its path between the ribs, the body would guide it the rest of the way. That is the anatomy and physics of a crime. Time of collapse would have been fast, unconsciousness within just minutes. Paramedics arrived at 22:50, but despite their efforts, Scarlett's time on this earth ended shortly before midnight. The science did not claim to know intent. It did not claim to read minds. But what it could say is how things move and behave, how fabrics resist, how bone channels, how an impact like this is made. And when the court compared those laws of movement to the shifting stories from the kitchen, one version kept failing the test. Teesside Crown Court heard the case over 10 days. On one side, prosecutor Mark McCone KC, who told the jury that the injury could not have been inflicted accidentally. On the other, defence barrister Nicholas Lumley KC, who painted Simon as a doting father with no desire or wish to harm her in any way at all. The prosecution leaned heavily on Dr. Bolton's conclusion that the wound was a product of a firm grip and a braced arm. They argued irritation fueled by alcohol that had led to a momentary loss of temper. This had gone beyond horseplay, McCone said. The defence conceded moral responsibility, but not legal guilt. They said Simon was devastated, broken, already serving a life sentence in grief. They pointed to the lack of motive, to the family's closeness, to the total absence of prior violence towards Scarlett. They said, why murder your reason for living? Jurors were reminded they didn't have to know why, only how. After more than 13 hours of deliberation, they returned a majority verdict. 10 for guilty, 2 for not guilty. In the gallery, mother and wife Sarah looked stunned. Simon sat still.
A man has been convicted for the murder of his 14-year-old daughter at Teesside Crown Court. Simon Viggers stabbed his daughter Scarlett in the heart while they were play fighting in the kitchen. He did not visibly react when a jury found him guilty.
Good afternoon. I'm Detective Superintendent Craig Rudd from Durham Constabulary. Scarlett Vickers would have celebrated her 16th birthday this year. She had a whole life ahead of her. Yet it was cruelly cut short by her own father, a man who was meant to protect her. We may never know why or what caused Simon Vickers to do what he did that night. And sadly, today's verdict will not bring Scarlett back, but he will now face the consequences of his actions. I would like to thank my investigation team for their tireless efforts in getting justice for Scarlett, and the community for their cooperation and understanding while we carried out our inquiries. Our thoughts remain with those who cared about Scarlett. Thank you.
On the 10th of February, Simon Vickers stood in the dock as Mr. Justice Cotter delivered his sentencing remarks. Scarlett, the judge said, was a normal, healthy young woman with a long life ahead of her, when it was cut short by you. What had begun as an ordinary Friday night had become a tragedy. And it happened within seconds due to what must have been your loss of temper. The judge told Vickers he had never given a truthful explanation of what happened in that kitchen. The weapon, he said, must have been in your hand before, during and after the event. The wound's depth, 11 centimetres into the heart, was not the result of trifling force. Scarlett's age and the fact she was in her own home were serious aggravating factors. There was no premeditation, the judge accepted this, but it was a momentary, devastating act of anger. For murder, the law prescribed only one sentence, life imprisonment. The father was told he must serve a minimum of 15 years before being considered for release, minus the 217 days already spent on remand. Only he, the judge said, knew precisely what happened in those final moments. Scarlett Vickers should have been planning outfits for her Gran Canaria holiday. She should have been laughing at breakfast with her parents the next morning. Instead, her last conscious sight was the kitchen of the home where she'd grown up, the familiar surroundings, the panic on her parents' faces. Her father will now spend years behind bars. Her mother still stands by him. And the truth about what happened between the grapes, the tongs, and that final moment remains locked inside the one person who has refused to tell it. The why may never be known.
You have been found guilty of the murder of your daughter, Scarlett Vickers, on the 5th of April 2024 in your family home. A normal, healthy young girl with a long life ahead of her when it was cut short by you. She died in the kitchen of her own home within minutes of having been stabbed. It went from an ordinary, happy family Friday night to tragedy within seconds due to what must have been your loss of temper. There is no other plausible explanation. You have never given a truthful explanation of what happened. This was a Friday night. After work, you'd smoked some and drunk some wine. I'm satisfied, given the evidence, you drank more than the 3/4 of a bottle of wine or 4 glasses that you've said you drank. Scarlett came home and was in her bedroom whilst you watched football on the television. You then joined Sarah Hall as she cooked your evening meal. Scarlett came downstairs at about 10:15 to join you in that small kitchen. She and her mother were throwing grapes. You wanted them to stop. Sarah Hall then pinched you on the bottom from behind with some cooking tongs. As you turned, she caught your finger with the tongs and you said, "Ow." Scarlett then said words to the effect of, "Dad, don't be a wimp." Sarah Hall turned her back to resume cooking and heard you say to Scarlett, "How would you like it?" Exactly what then happened, only you know. Scarlett said, "Ow, ow," and Sarah Hall turned to see her standing there injured. There was no in her, because I'm satisfied you'd taken it out as part of the motion. It would not have been possible for Sarah Hall to have missed it unless it was already back on the kitchen surface where you placed it and where it was later noted to be when the paramedics arrived. I have no doubt that you had hold of the knife before, during, and after Scarlett was stabbed. Scarlett died as a result of a single knife wound to the left side of her chest. To stab Scarlett, you must have been close to her. She was also stabbed in part of her chest, normally protected by the arm. After being stabbed, Scarlett stood in the area close to the back door before she collapsed. As Sarah Hall said, the last thing she must have seen was panic on your faces. Simon Vickers, you've given different accounts of what has happened. Specifically, that she was stabbed by accident, that you'd been throwing knives, that you'd thrown a spatula or tongs, that Scarlett lunged towards the knife, and that you were swiping tongs along the kitchen surface. Indeed, the unconvincing and wholly implausible version of events you gave to the jury involved you swiping tongs along the kitchen surface before them flying up into the air, and that you'd not even been aware of a knife before or after Scarlett suffered injury. Indeed, you said knife wasn't in any equation except when Sarah Hall had been cutting onions. For the grave offence of murder, there is only one sentence by law that I can pass, and that is imprisonment for life. The clock cannot be turned back. You must now face the consequences that the law dictates. Simon Vickers, for the murder of Scarlett Vickers, I sentence you to life imprisonment. You will serve a minimum term of 15 years, less the 217 days you were served on remand. You may go down.
What I'm thinking this is all about is someone I was talking to over on Craigslist. I was just on there, looking for pen pals.
Detectives didn't really need Lopez to tell them where Natalie Bollinger met her end. The coordinates led them to the 11600 block of Riverdale Road, Adams County, a lonely strip that threads past McIntosh Dairy, the kind of place where headlights vanish into the darkness.
Yeah, Jim, on Thursday, she was reported missing. On Friday, the very next day, someone passing through this area found her body. Today, at a news conference, the sheriff asked for anyone with information about that time period to come forward.
The last 26 hours of 19-year-old Natalie Bollinger's life are a mystery.
We don't have anybody who was either talking with her through social media or through text or in person or on the telephone.
Family reported the teen missing on Thursday, December 28th. The following day, a body was discovered off a rural road in Adams County.
We really didn't have a whole lot of information. We were still actually even trying to come up with a name, a way of trying to identify who she was.
A Facebook post Bollinger made just 1 week before her disappearance fueled a firestorm of speculation on social media. The post was a public warning about a man she said had been stalking her for years. She filed a restraining order against that man, Sean Schwartz.
We have talked to him, and again, not ready to call anybody a suspect.
Schwartz made his own posts about the accusations, even calling Natalie a friend.
Please help find her, please. Please help.
The Adams County Sheriff says the posts are part of their investigation, but warned of the trouble social media can cause.
Our goal is to make sure that we're not heading down a path, down a rabbit trail that we don't need to go down.
The day after Natalie went missing, a passerby had spotted her there, face down in the snow-dusted grass, 9mm casings just feet away. The coroner would later confirm what detectives had suspected, one single blast from a firearm to the head. But there was something else, an extraordinarily high dose of heroin in her blood. And if I have to redact that word, I'm talking about the substance that comes from poppies. There was enough of the substance in her system to end her time on this earth without the bullet. So when Lopez sat in that chair, detectives didn't start with the why. They started with, how many stories are you planning to tell us today? Natalie Bollinger was born in Westminster, Colorado, and grew up alongside her twin sister Alicia in a close and loving family. She lived in Colorado, also Virginia and Rhode Island, and was known for her caring nature, her love for animals, and her artistic talents from a young age. Emerging from a challenging adolescence, she persevered, excelling academically and enrolling in college, with aspirations to become a registered nurse.
And Dylan, detectives there say that social media played a big role in this investigation.
Yeah, we're told Natalie Bollinger was quite the typical teenager. She spent a lot of time on her cell phone and she spent a lot of time on social media. Ultimately, it would be those interactions online that would lead the sheriff's department to their suspect. Soon after Natalie Bollinger was found dead in late December, law enforcement used her cell phone to trace the final moments of her life.
As you can imagine, a 19-year-old social media or phone, there's a lot of data there.
Sheriff Mike McIntosh said Bollinger was active on social media.
It was there that we found a lot of the people that we interviewed. There were a lot of names that were thrown at us, and we went down every one of those.
But one specifically caught their attention.
In 2015, Natalie was just 17 and known for her generosity. She'd helped out a man named Sean Schwartz. He was homeless in his mid-30s, with straggly tangled hair and a quick temper. At first it was kindness, but then it became something else. Schwartz followed her to Virginia when she moved. He even slept behind her workplace for weeks on end. When Natalie tried to cut contact, the calls, the emails, and the social media messages exploded. There was threats against her family. There was constant demands for attention. And over the span of 2 years, Natalie blocked him on all platforms again and again, but he just would not leave her alone.
What drew me to what she had posted was it was very weird.
Do you recall kind of what that said that got your attention?
Well, the title itself just said, I'm thinking about putting a hit on myself. So my first thought was, okay, someone obviously needs help and hasn't been getting the help that they need. Being the type of person that I am, I will do anything to help someone at least stay alive. My first thought was, I really want to help this girl. So after a little bit, I was like, I'm not getting anywhere. Let's see if I can convince her to meet up with me and see what happens.
In the interrogation room, Lopez didn't seem nervous. He began talking about an unusual Craigslist ad titled, he claimed, "I want to put a hit on myself." He told detectives that he'd replied out of curiosity, just pretending to be a hitman. They exchanged over 100 messages, and after his shift at Domino's, he picked Natalie up in Broomfield. He said that they then drove around scouting for places where she might like to meet her end.
Drove around for a little bit, like 2-3 hours, I can't remember exactly, and we just talked. Eventually, I think she either got fed up with me, because I guess she was pretty serious about what was going on, and, she said, just drop me off here. That's last time I saw her, really. It sucks that it turned out the way it did.
Natalie allegedly told him that she was having problems with her boyfriend and that it had all become too much. And according to him, they couldn't settle on a location, so he simply took her home. And that was the end of it, or so he claimed. But the problem with this claim is that the GPS trail didn't end at her apartment. It ended exactly where her body was found, and detectives had the printout sitting right there on the table. Natalie used Facebook like a diary. On December 13th, 2017, she posted a public warning. It read, "Hey y'all, I have a public announcement. There is a man named Sean Schwartz. I met him when I was young, and about 2 years ago we crossed paths again. I helped him out with rides and things. Then I moved to Virginia. He drove across the country to see me. He slept behind my work for weeks. When I told him I didn't want to see him anymore, he sent me hundreds of texts and calls. He parked his car in front of my house, blocking the road for hours. Laying on his horn, he was arrested. Since then, I've asked him to leave me alone, and he won't. He's made countless accounts to get around being blocked, threatens my family, says he'll take his life in front of me, and harass my friends and family. If you get a message from him, please ignore it. Responding only encourages him." Friends rallied in the comments. They told Natalie to stay safe, to simply call the police, to document everything that was happening to her. But there was a hitch that she didn't know about. Schwartz was already inside the thread. He was using a fake profile, repeatedly defending himself. He was urging everyone to re-examine their intentions. Natalie pressed ahead anyway, and just 2 days later she filed for a restraining order. That order was granted on December the 22nd, and just 6 days after that, she vanished. This Facebook post would become a lighthouse for investigators. It set the internet on fire. It also set a trap. Everyone was looking at Schwartz. With all eyes on Sean Schwartz, perhaps someone else was left unseen. Back in the interview room, detectives let Lopez talk. He pivoted, a new version of events. He said he'd taken a wrong turn after location scouting, and he ended up at a dairy farm off Riverdale Road. He says that Natalie got out the car. She kneeled down. She took a 9mm from her bag, and according to Lopez, she acted before he could stop her. He claimed that right there on that spot, her time on this earth came to an end. He says he panicked and he left, that he didn't call 911, and that he didn't wait for officers.
It's very, very difficult in these cases, even if there's a stated motive, to really determine long-term what that motive truly is.
Detectives listened to this new version, and then they slid over the autopsy findings. One blast to the head. There was stippling and peppering around the wound. This meant that the muzzle was not pressed to the skin. A forensic pathologist later testified that the shot must have come from roughly 14 to 15 inches away, most likely 6 to 12 inches. That distance matters. It argued against it being done by the victim in the way that Lopez described. It argued that it was done by someone else stood behind her. Detectives added the GPS points, his car pausing near the cul-de-sac, the time window matching the disappearance. They asked him to explain the physics of it all, the angle, the distance, the absence of a call for help. Lopez just stared down at his hands. The second story was now unraveling too. He took a breath and then offered a third. December the 28th, 2017, began like any other winter morning in Broomfield. Natalie was still living with her boyfriend, Joseph Marino. He left for work just after 6 a.m., leaving her at the apartment. When Marino returned that afternoon, two things were gone: Natalie and his 9mm Glock. Her phone was still at the house, and by that evening she was officially reported missing. Search efforts spread quickly. Social media posts, calls to friends, urgent messages sent to anyone who might have seen her. Given the recent restraining order against Sean Schwartz, his name was the first on everybody's lips. But Schwartz was not in hiding. He was instead, of course, on Facebook, arguing in public threads, insisting that he'd done nothing wrong. In reality, Natalie had spent part of that day texting with another man, a man that she'd never actually met in person. That was Joseph Michael Lopez. Those 111 messages, exchanged over just a few hours, would guide investigators right to him, and also to the GPS data from his phone and car. In turn, those would guide them to the place where Natalie's life ended.
To try to figure out what happened to her, all right? And I think that you know. There's some things I think you're leaving out, bro. Okay? Just ask right now that you just come forward, bro. And you get everything off your chest.
Confronted with the forensics that didn't fit either of his first two accounts, Lopez's third story came into play. This time he said he tried to save her, tried to talk her out of it. He said they'd driven around for an extended period, circling possible locations. He said that she was insistent. Near the dairy farm, he said that she got out and kneeled in the cold grass. He said that he stood behind her, that they prayed together, and then, eyes closed and shaking, he made the blast ring out. Lopez claimed that he couldn't look, that he turned his head away, that he freaked out afterwards. In his trunk, detectives later found Natalie's purse and the Glock, the very same weapon that boyfriend Marino reported missing from his apartment. Lopez's explanation had shifted yet again in smaller ways, but the heart of it remained. He now admitted to pulling the trigger. Whether it was murder, her own decision, or something far darker, all of that was now for the court to decide. Originally, prosecutors charged Lopez with first-degree murder, a charge carrying a mandatory life sentence if convicted. But in February of 2019, the case shifted. Lopez agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, the first-degree charge was dropped. The maximum penalty for that is 48 years.
After several emotional statements from Natalie's family, the judge gave Lopez the maximum sentence under his plea deal, 48 years in prison with 5 years parole. Now, before coming to that deal, the DA weighed every possible outcome and how the jury might have viewed the facts given. Despite the Bollingers' disapproval, Natalie's maternal side of the family says they're at peace with the sentence.
What we took because that was the most we could probably get without a jury agreeing 100%, because that's what would have taken for first-degree murder and life in prison.
Natalie's family wasn't told about the deal until it was already in motion. At sentencing, Natalie's father, Ted, stood in court and addressed the man who had admitted to doing all of this. "You took advantage of my daughter," he said. "She was vulnerable. You premeditated, brutally shot and killed my baby. I asked for an eye for an eye. You have been protected." The Bollinger family had no say in this. This is a deal with the devil.
It was a very emotional morning here. That courtroom was full of Natalie's friends and family. Now, Natalie's father, Ted Bollinger, was able to speak in court this morning while in custody for a parole violation. Bollinger told the judge he did not agree with the plea deal offered to Lopez because a deal was not justice. He also said that neither he nor his side of the family were told about the deal at the earliest date possible. The judge denied his request to continue the hearing because the prosecution says they made several attempts to contact the Bollinger family.
The Bollinger family had no say in this deal. This is no justice. I look at this deal as a deal with the devil. Mallory Marie Bollinger was a person. She had a life. Her life mattered more than you will ever know.
Anusha, this plea deal spared Joseph Lopez the possibility of a first-degree murder conviction and the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison with no chance of parole. It was just after Christmas last year that Lopez saw that Craigslist ad that you mentioned, in which Bollinger effectively put a hit on herself. According to court documents, she'd previously expressed thoughts and had trouble with drugs. But today in court, it was not her dark days that were remembered by her family, it was her many happy ones.
Hey Grandma, it's Napa. I just wanted to call and say happy Merry Christmas Eve and I love you a bunch. And if you still want to come over tomorrow, okay. I love you. Have a great day.
That's who he took. That's who he took from us. She was young, beautiful, and had her future ahead of her.
Lopez is 23 years old. Under the terms of this deal and state law, he'll have to serve at least 36 years before he can apply for parole. But the fact that he could get out did not sit well with some members of her family, who really wanted a first-degree murder conviction, and in fact her father even called for him to receive the death penalty.
Lopez stood silently as family members spoke. He offered no apology. But what he did have to offer was the same version of events that he had finally settled on in the interrogation room. If the full prison term is served, Lopez will be 71 when he finally gets out. No Craigslist ad was ever found, and despite repeated searches and subpoenas to the site, no evidence surfaced that Natalie ever posted an ad asking for her own demise. That detail seemed to exist solely in Lopez's account. The brown in her system, I'm talking about the stuff from the poppy, a dose that most people wouldn't survive, was never fully explained. Toxicology confirmed its presence, but the investigation never determined who supplied it, when she took it, or why. There is also the question of the firearm. If Lopez's account is accurate, then Natalie brought it along. If not, he either took it himself or obtained it in some other way. And then of course there is Sean Schwartz. He maintains his innocence, insisting his relationship with Natalie was misunderstood, that he was actually a friend and not a threat. Police no longer consider him a suspect in any way. For the public, the case closed with Lopez's conviction. For Natalie's family, the unanswered questions remain an open wound. In September of 2019, less than 2 years after Natalie's end, her twin sister Alicia Bollinger was also reported missing in Abilene, Texas. Local authorities issued alerts, and friends and relatives pleaded for information on social media. Thankfully, this time Alicia was located safe soon after, though details of the circumstances were never fully publicly explained. For the Bollinger family though, it was a harrowing reminder of just how fragile life can feel once it's been pieced together after being shattered into millions of pieces. Two sisters bound by birth had now been the focus of urgent searches in the span of just 21 months. Natalie Bollinger would be in her 20s now, studying nursing, working towards a life that she once planned. Instead, her story is anchored to a snowy patch of ground off Riverdale Road, and to a man she barely knew. Whether Joseph Lopez was the predator that prosecutors described, or he was in fact the twisted helper that he claimed to be, we will probably never fully know. Laurie Vlow appeared to be living the suburban dream. She was the radiant, outgoing former beauty queen, always smiling, always well dressed. To friends and family, she was a deeply devoted mother. She doted on her 3 children. There was Colby from a previous marriage, Tylee from her third, and later JJ, whom she and her 4th husband Charles had adopted. By 2014, the family had settled into an affluent neighborhood in Arizona. Charles, a successful businessman, provided financially. Laurie stayed at home and made every effort to appear to be the ideal wife and mother. But there were cracks, just ones that most people didn't see. According to her son Colby, Laurie's beliefs had always been intense. She devoured religious podcasts, she believed in signs, and she was growing increasingly obsessed with end times theology, particularly around the LDS Church. Still, no one could expect where all of this could lead. In public, she played the role of the doting mother, but behind closed doors, Laurie was reading apocalyptic fiction, books written by a former gravedigger in Idaho. That author's name was Chad Daybell. And when Laurie finally met him at a religious conference in late 2018, the fuse was lit. The first time that Laurie met Chad, she was totally mesmerized. It was October of 2018, when they crossed paths at Preparing the People, which is a religious conference in St. George, Utah. The event featured speakers promoting visions of the end times, of alternative prophecy, and of spiritual preparedness. Chad, soft-spoken and unassuming, had a devoted following. He'd written a series of apocalyptic novels, loosely based on LDS beliefs, stories of righteous survivors, of heavenly visions, and of dark spirits that walked amongst the living. But Chad didn't just write fiction. He believed that he could speak directly to God, and that he had been given a mission. Laurie hung on his every word, and Chad, in turn, told her that she was a goddess, an actual immortal being, chosen to usher in the second coming. He said she had lived many past lives, and now, in this one, she was meant to help gather the 144,000 souls destined to survive the end of the world. There was instant chemistry. Within weeks, they were reportedly communicating daily. Laurie started telling friends that she was on a spiritual mission. She claimed her husband, Charles, had been possessed by a dark spirit. She said her children were obstacles to her greater purpose. But in reality, Laurie and Chad were now entangled in something far darker than prophecy. They had become completely obsessed with sorting the world into light and dark spirits. Anyone deemed dark was considered spiritually dead, and according to Chad, spiritually dead people could be removed. From the outside, Laurie still looked like the same bubbly Arizona mum, but inside her home, things had turned surreal. She was telling her teenage daughter Tylee that certain people in their lives were no longer human. She said that they were zombies, and that she, Laurie, had been chosen by God to rid the world of them. Chad claimed that he had a spiritual scale, and each person he met, he said, could be rated numerically. This was based on how close they were to light or darkness. If someone's spirit dropped below a certain point or a certain score, this meant that they were possessed, that their bodies could be inhabited by demons or other dark entities. And Laurie seemed to wholeheartedly believe this. She too started labeling people. Charles, her husband, was now Ned Schneider, a name she claimed belonged to the demon inside of him. She told friends that he was already dead, that the man that was walking around in his body wasn't actually Charles anymore. And then came the list. Laurie and Chad began tracking people around them, rating their light or dark percentage. Even her own children did not escape that list. At one point, Chad allegedly told Laurie that 16-year-old Tylee had become a zombie, that her spirit had been replaced, and that she, too, could now be removed. What started as a fringe religious belief had now transformed into a system of bizarre justification. They weren't just preparing for the end times anymore. They believed that they were purifying the world, and the first real-world consequence of that belief system was just around the corner. By early 2019, Charles Vlow knew that something was deeply wrong. Laurie had now become obsessed with Chad Daybell. She was vanishing for days at a time, claiming that she was on missions from God. She pretty much stopped sleeping altogether. She said she no longer needed food or rest, because she herself was a divine being. And then one day, she told Charles that she was not Laurie anymore. She was now an eternal goddess named Living Zoe, and that he was in the way of her destiny. Charles begged for help. In January, he contacted the police and filed for divorce. He told officers that Laurie had threatened his life. He said that she believed he was possessed by a demon and needed to die. I want her to get help, he told them. She's gone. I don't know who she is anymore. Charles even tried to initiate a mental health intervention. Laurie was held for psychiatric evaluation, but she was released in less than 24 hours. In July, Charles returned to the family home to pick up JJ, and inside was Laurie and her brother Alex Cox. Just moments later, Alex called 911. He said that Charles had attacked him, that he'd pulled the trigger in self-defense, but the story didn't add up. Charles was blasted twice in the chest, and at that time JJ was in the house and so was Tylee. However, thankfully neither of them were hurt. But Laurie, she left the scene smiling. She took JJ to Burger King and didn't even mention the shooting to the police until hours later. Charles's final warning had gone unheard, and now the only person standing between Laurie and total devotion to Chad was gone.
And you may not know this, so, because I know you heard the shot, do you know at what point your brother had the gun? Do you know if he had it when they got in their first fight, or did he have to go get it, or do you know that at all?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
And do you remember if you ever heard your brother?
I didn't see him ever leave the room.
Okay.
So it was so fast. All that was so fast. Like him on the ground, rolling around, and I'm screaming. And
this probably happened in a couple seconds.
Yeah, I mean, it was like super fast.
And I don't know if you know this or not, does your brother normally carry a gun? Like, I carry a gun everywhere I go.
Right. Like, I know he's a gun person. Like, he has guns and things.
Okay.
He's good with guns.
Did you know that he had one with him?
No.
When he came over?
No, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did, because he's very, very professional with guns.
Proficient, professional. Responsible is usually a good word.
Right, responsible with guns.
After Charles met his end, things moved fast. Laurie packed up the kids and left Arizona. She moved to Rexburg, Idaho. This was just minutes away from Chad Daybell's house. By late August of 2019, 16-year-old Tylee was seen for the final time. She was photographed with JJ, Laurie and Alex during a family day trip to Yellowstone. But then she just vanished. Laurie claimed that she'd gone off to college early, but no records supported that. No friends ever heard from her again. And then just weeks later, JJ disappeared too. He was last seen on September the 23rd. He was playing outside the townhouse that Laurie had just rented. The next day, Laurie told the school that she was pulling him out of education, saying that she was going to homeschool him from now on. She never spoke of him again. When concerned relatives started asking questions, Laurie gave only vague answers. First she said that Tylee was attending BYU, then she claimed that JJ was staying with a friend. Later she insisted that both children were safe and happy, but by this time, Chad's wife Tammy was also growing suspicious of everything. She reportedly told friends that Chad was growing distant and distracted, and he was now being secretive about his phone. In early October, someone wearing a mask attempted to take her out in her own driveway. Just 10 days after this attempt, Tammy was found no longer breathing in her own bed. Chad claimed that she'd coughed and passed away in her sleep, and the coroner did rule this as natural causes. But within just 2 weeks, Chad and Laurie were getting married on a beach in Hawaii. She wore white, he wore a shell necklace, and not one of Laurie's children was present, nor were they mentioned during the ceremony. By Thanksgiving of that year, JJ's parents had filed a missing persons report, and when police questioned Laurie in Rexburg, she told them that JJ was in Arizona with a friend. That friend had no idea what she was talking about. Tammy Daybell was just 49 years old when she passed away suddenly in her sleep on October the 19th, 2019. Her death was just ruled as natural causes. But to those who really knew her, this didn't really make sense. Tammy was active and healthy. She had shown no signs of illness at all. In fact, she had just completed a fun run. She taught computer classes at a local school. She was solid in both body and mind. There were no warning signs, other than her growing unease with husband, Chad. But in this case, the deeper you go, the weirder it all gets. Tammy had recently posted online about some strange events. One entry described a man in a ski mask who had aimed at her with what looked like a paintball gun in her own driveway. She said that she just laughed it off, but as we know, just weeks later, she was gone. By December of 2019, police were done asking nicely. A court ordered Laurie to produce her children within 5 days. However, she simply just ignored them.
Mr. Vlow, sir. Do you have any questions regarding that? So it is 14:39 hours on January 25th.
Do you need something?
Any questions? You have any questions for that?
So in January of 2020, police arrested her in Cowie, charging her with desertion and obstruction. Media swarmed the island. Cameras captured Laurie smiling as she walked hand in hand with Chad, wearing a lei. Still though, no sign of the kids whatsoever. The question now echoed across the country. Where were JJ and Ty Lee? While Laurie and Chad were enjoying their new life in Hawaii, another piece of the puzzle was unfolding hundreds of miles away. In Arizona, Laurie's extended circle was under growing suspicion. One of those connected was her niece, Melanie Pulowski. Melanie had recently divorced Brandon Boudreau, and their split was far from amicable. In October of 2019, Brandon was driving home when a bullet shattered the driver's side window of his Tesla. He survived, but he told police that he believed the shooter was Alex Cox, Laurie's brother, the very same man who had shot and killed Charles Vlow months earlier. Weeks later in November, Melanie appeared unexpectedly at Brandon's parents' home in Utah. Body cam footage from that day shows Brandon's mother telling officers that she feared Melanie was trying to take the children. Brandon, speaking to police himself, mentioned that his attempted homicide case was now connected to 2 other murders under FBI investigation. According to courtroom documents, Brandon believed that Melanie had somehow become involved with what he called a cult led by Chad Daybell and Laurie. He suspected the group was now targeting him. 2 days after that visit, Melanie returned to the home, this time with Alex Cox by her side. Police arrested her for trespassing, and it was Alex who posted her bail. Years later in 2022, Laurie Vlow Daybell would be indicted for conspiring alongside brother Alex to put an end to Brandon. She was convicted of that charge in 2023. Just a month after the trespassing incident, the man at the centre of so many of these allegations was suddenly gone. On December 12, 2019, Alex Cox was found unresponsive in a Gilbert, Arizona home. The Maricopa County medical examiner later ruled his death as natural, saying it was caused by blood clots in the lungs, with high blood pressure and heart disease as contributing factors. For some, this timing was striking. In fact, Alex passed away just 1 day after Tammy Daybell's body was exhumed for that full autopsy. He had been a key figure in multiple investigations, including the deaths of Charles Vlow and the attempt on Brandon Boudreau's life. Police said they initially considered his death suspicious, but ultimately they could find no foul play. Alex's family publicly stated that there was no sinister aspect to his passing. Even so, with his death, one of the most important witnesses and alleged participants in this growing web of violence and death was gone. By spring of 2020, the tide was turning. Authorities had Tammy Daybell's body exhumed. She could now have a full autopsy. They also re-interviewed Laurie's friends and relatives. And, most critically, they began closing in on Chad's property in Rexburg.
Amazon transaction receipts and search history obtained by our content partner East Idaho News revealed new dates in the investigation's timeline. As you may remember, Lori's last husband, Charles Vlow, was shot and killed back on July 11th by her brother, Alex Cox, who claimed self-defense. Then, on October 2nd, Amazon transaction record shows someone bought a wedding ring from Charles's account and had it delivered to Lori's townhome in Idaho. The next day, search history shows someone using Charles's Amazon account again, this time to look for wedding dresses. On October 19th, Chad Daybell's wife Tammy passes away of what was originally thought of as natural causes. Just 17 days later, on November 5th, Lori and Chad get married in Hawaii. Lori wearing that ring purchased on Charles's Amazon account.
Phone data revealed something chilling. On the morning of September the 9th, 2019, the day after Tylee was last seen alive, Chad's backyard lit up with activity. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, had spent nearly 2 hours there. He was moving back and forth between the house and a specific spot near the tree line of the yard. Then on September the 23rd, the last known day that JJ was seen alive, Alex returned once again. This time he stayed for just 17 minutes. In June of 2020, investigators finally got a search warrant for Chad's property. They arrived early in the morning, quietly setting up a perimeter. Chad sat in his car and watched, and it really wouldn't take long for this whole thing to unravel. Within just hours, investigators uncovered a makeshift grave. Inside was a tightly wrapped black plastic bag. Within it were charred remains. These were identified as Tylee, partially incinerated and dismantled. So badly, in fact, that she had to be identified through her dental records. However, this garden had even more secrets just waiting to be found. Just a few yards away, beneath a patch of sod, they found JJ. His body was wrapped in plastic and was bound with duct tape. His hands were folded across his chest. Chad tried to flee the scene in his SUV, but officers intercepted him just down the road. He was arrested on the spot.
Lori Vlow Daybell remains behind bars in Idaho, charged with deserting her children, while her new husband, Chad Daybell, also behind bars, accused of concealing evidence. Now, one name that stands out in this affidavit is the children's uncle, Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Investigators in Idaho say they were able to trace pings from Alex Cox's cell phone, putting him for an extended period of time in Chad Daybell's backyard the day after Tylee was last seen alive in early September and the day after JJ was last seen alive in late September. And when investigators searched the property last week, they say they used Alex Cox's cell phone pings to find the location where the bodies were ultimately found.
The human remains found on Chad Daybell's property are officially identified as the missing kids. The Rexburg Police Department announcing the findings earlier today following autopsies performed in Boise. The remains were found at Daybell's home in Salem Tuesday after a search warrant was issued. Authorities have not released details about the conditions of the remains. Rexburg Police, Fremont County Sheriff deputies, along with the FBI, made the discovery in Daybell's backyard.
Lori, already in custody, now faced even more charges. Her smile all but vanished, and across the world, the image of her 2 offspring, their bright eyes and innocent faces, was now seared into public memory. What Lori and Chad had done was no longer just a speculation. The law was finally about to catch up with them. Lori Vallow's trial began in April of 2023, nearly 4 years after her children vanished. The courtroom was packed out. Photos of the brother and sister were placed where their mother could see them. In them, they were smiling, laughing, and full of life. Prosecutors painted Lori as the architect of their deaths, that she was not driven by faith, but instead by lust, power, and obsession. They said that she used religion to justify removing every obstacle between her and Chad, her husband, her children, and Chad's own wife. The state introduced dozens of texts between Lori and Chad. Some were flirtatious, some were just bizarre, and others were downright chilling. One message sent shortly after Tylee vanished read, "She is gone, freed from the dark. Thank you for helping me." Lori's defense argued that she had simply been manipulated by Chad, that she believed her children were now being protected, that she was not in control of her actions. After 6 weeks of testimony and just 7 hours of deliberation, Lori Vlow Daybell was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder of Tylee Ryan, conspiracy to commit murder of JJ Vlow, conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, and multiple counts of grand theft and obstruction. She was sentenced to multiple life terms, without the possibility of parole. And yet, Idaho was only the beginning. This story is not over yet. In 2024, Arizona formally charged Lori for the murder of Charles Vlow, the husband that she had once claimed was actually a demon named Ned. Prosecutors there weren't buying the self-defense story. Phone records, text messages, and witness testimony all showed a coordinated plan between Lori and her brother Alex. Alex Cox had conveniently passed away of natural causes in 2019, but Lori was still alive, and Arizona wanted accountability. Her extradition was swift. By early 2025, Lori Vlow once again stood trial. This time it was for her role in Charles's passing. She pleaded not guilty, but the mountain of evidence said otherwise. In June of 2025, Lori was convicted once again. She got another life sentence, which was just stacked on top of the others. As of today, Lori Vlow Daybell will never see freedom again. She sits in prison, her once celestial mission now just reduced to cold concrete and razor wire. She'll have a lot of time to think. And if Lori thought she had it bad, at the end of May 2024, Chad Daybell was sentenced to death for the murders of his former wife and JJ and Tylee. Let me know your thoughts on this case down below. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.